Dr. Schrader had been working at an insecticide lab for IG Farben in Leverkusen, north of Cologne, for several years. By the fall of 1936, he had an important job on his hands. Weevils and leaf lice were destroying grain across Germany, and Schrader was tasked with creating a synthetic pesticide that could eradicate these tiny pests. The government had been spending 30 million Reichsmarks a year on pesticides made by Farben as well as other companies. IG Farben wanted to develop an insect killer that could save money for the Reich and earn the company a monopoly on pesticides. Synthesizing organic, carbon-based compounds was trial and error work, Dr. Schrader told Major Tilly. It was labor-intensive and dangerous. Schrader, a family man, took excellent precautions against exposure, always working under a fume hood. Even trace amounts of the chemicals he was using had cumulative, potentially lethal effects. Schrader suffered from frequent headaches and sometimes felt short of breath. One night, while driving home after working on a new product, Schrader could barely see the road in front of him. When he pulled over to examine his eyes in the mirror, he saw that his pupils had constricted to the size of a pinhead. Over the next several days his vision grew worse. He developed a throbbing pressure in his larynx. Finally, Schrader checked himself into a hospital, where he was monitored for 2 weeks before being sent home and told to rest. 8 days after the respite, Schrader returned to work. He had been developing a cyanide-containing fumigant, which he had given the code name Preparation 991. Picking up where he'd left off with his work, he prepared a small amount of his new substance, diluting it to 1 in 200,000 units to see if it would kill lice clinging to leaves. He was stunned when his new creation killed 100% of the lice. Schrader repeated the experiment for his colleagues. They all agreed that Preparation 991 was 100 times more lethal than anything anyone at the Leverkusen lab had ever worked with before. Dr. Schrader sent a sample of this lethal new fumigant to Farben's director of industrial hygiene, a man named Professor Eberhard Gross. Gross tested the substance on apes and was duly shocked by the results. After a healthy ape was injected with a tiny amount of Preparation 9/91, just 1/10 of a milligram per kilo of body weight, the ape died in less than an hour. Next, Gross tested the substance on an ape inside an inhalation chamber. He watched this healthy ape die in 16 minutes. Professor Gross told Dr. Schrader that his Preparation 991 was being sent to Berlin and that he should wait for further instruction on what action to take next. At Dustbin, Schrader told Major Tilly that when he learned his compound could kill a healthy ape through airborne contact in minutes, he became upset. His discovery was never going to be used as an insecticide, Schrader lamented. It was simply too dangerous for any warm-blooded animal or human to come into contact with. Schrader said his goal was to save money for the Reich. With the news of how powerful Preparation 991 was, Schrader felt he'd failed at his job. He got back to work, searching for a fumigant better suited for the task of killing weevils and leaf lice. Meanwhile, Professor Gross brought the substance to his superiors. Starting in 1935, a Reich ordinance required all new discoveries with potential military application to be reported to the War Office. The Reich's Chemical Weapons Department began to evaluate Schrader's Preparation 991 for its potential use in chemical warfare. In May 1937, Schrader was invited to Berlin to demonstrate how he'd synthesized Preparation 991. Everyone was astounded, Schrader told Tilly. This was the most promising chemical killer since the Germans invented mustard gas. Preparation 991 was classified top secret and given a code name, Tabun gas. It came from the English word taboo, something prohibited or forbidden. Dr. Schrader was told to produce 1 kilogram for the German army, which would take over Tabun production on a massive scale. Schrader got a bonus of 50,000 Reichsmarks and was told to get back to work. Farben still needed him to develop a lice-killing insecticide. With their new nerve agent Tabun, Farben executives saw all kinds of business opportunities. Karl Krauch, the head of Farben's board of directors, began working with Hermann Göring on a longer-range plan to arm Germany with chemical weapons, ones that could eventually be dropped on the enemy from airplanes. In his report to Göring, Krauk called Tabun the weapon of superior intelligence and superior scientific technological thinking. The beauty in the nerve agent, Krauk told Göring, was that it could be used against the enemy's hinterland. Göring agreed, adding that what he liked most about chemical weapons was that they terrified people. He responded to Krauk in writing, noting that the deadly effects of nerve agents like Tabun gas could wreak psychological havoc on civilian populations, driving them crazy with fear. On August 22, 1938, Göring named Karl Krauk his plenipotentiary for special questions of chemical production. Farben was now positioned to build the Reich's chemical weapons industry from the ground up. The Treaty of Versailles had forced Germany to destroy all its chemical weapons factories after World War I, which meant factories had to be secretly built. This was an enormous undertaking, now an official part of the Nazis' secret 4-year plan, and through Krauk IG Farben was made privy to the Reich's war plan before war was declared. At the Dustbin Interrogation Center, Major Tilly asked Schrader about full-scale production. Based on the Allies' discovery of thousands of tons of Tabun bombs in the forests outside Roggkammer, Farben must have had an enormous secret production facility somewhere. Dr. Schrader said that he was not involved in full-scale production. That was the job of his colleague, Dr. Otto Ambros. Major Tilly asked Schrader to tell him more about Ambros. Schrader said that most of what Ambros did was classified, but that if Major Tilly wanted to know more about what he actually did for Farben, Tilly should talk to individuals who sat on Farben's board of directors with Ambros, either Dr. Karl Krauk or Baron George von Schnitzler. Both men were interned here at Dustbin. Who is Mr. Ambros? Major Tilly asked Baron George von Schnitzler, in an interview that would later be presented as evidence in a Nuremberg war crimes trial. He is one of our first, younger technicians, von Schnitzler said. He was in charge of Die Herrenfurt as well as Auschwitz and Genderg. Where was Ambros now? Tilly asked von Schnitzler. The Baron told Major Tilly to talk to Karl Krauk. From Krauk, Major Tilly learned quite a bit more about Ambros. That he had been in charge of technical development of chemical weapons production at Gendorf and at Die Herrenfurt. That Gendorf produced mustard gas on an industrial scale, and that Die Herrenfurt produced Tabun. Krauk also revealed a new piece of evidence. Die Herrenfurt produced a second nerve agent, one that was even more potent than Tabun, called sarin. Sarin was an acronym pieced together from the names of 4 key persons involved in its development, Schrader and Ambros from IG Farben and, from the German army, 2 officers named Rudiger and Linda. Krauk told Major Tilly that the Die Herrenfurt plant had fallen into Russian hands. Karl Krauk said something else that caught Major Tilly by surprise. Before coming to Dustbin, Krauk said he had been in the hospital, where he'd been paid a visit by 2 American officers, one of whom was Lieutenant Colonel Tarr. Judging from conversations I had a few months ago in the hospital with members of the USPs and chemical warfare, Krauk explained, the gentlemen seemed mostly interested in sarin and Tabun. They asked me for construction plans and details of fabrication. As far as I understood, they intended to erect similar plants in the USA. I told them to apply to Dr. Ambros and his staff at Gendorf. Major Tilly was shocked. Lieutenant Colonel Tarr was his CIO's partner, and yet Tarr had neglected to share with him the story about visiting Krauk in the hospital. This was Tilly's first indication that Tarr was running a separate mission for the U.S. Chemical Warfare Service, one that apparently had a different objective than the CIO's mission. The full, dramatic story was about to unfold. By June 1945, Otto Ambros had been questioned by soldiers with the Third Army numerous times. For reasons that remain obscure, no one from that division had been informed of the fact that Ambros was wanted for war crimes, or that he had served as Farben's chief of chemical weapons production throughout Hitler's rule. To the Third Army he was simply the plain chemist in the Bavarian village of Gendorf, the smiling, well-dressed businessman who supplied American soldiers with free bars of soap. At Dustbin, Major Tilly relayed this critical new information about Dr. Otto Ambros to his Fiat superiors, who in turn sent an urgent message to the 6th Army Group, also in Gendorf, ordering the immediate arrest of Dr. Ambros. The 6th Army was to transport Ambros directly to Dustbin so that Major Tilly could interrogate him. A note card was placed in Ambros's dossier. Disparate bits of information were now coming into sharp focus. Case number 21877. Dr. Otto Ambros. Rumored to have been involved in use of concentration camp personnel for testing effectiveness of new poison gases developed at Gendorf. Krokas notified Schaef, insisting that Dr. Ambros be arrested. As the plant manager at Farben's Buna factory at Auschwitz, Otto Ambros had been linked to atrocities including mass murder and slavery. The 6th Army Group swung into action. But when they arrived at Ambros's home in Gendorf, arrest orders in hand, Ambros was gone. The first assumption was that Ambros had fled on his own. This proved incorrect. He had been taken away by Lieutenant Colonel Philip Tarr. Initially, the commanding officer at Dustbin found this impossible to comprehend. It was one thing for Tarr to try to interview Ambros before any other chemical warfare experts did. That kind of rivalry had been going on ever since the various scientific intelligence teams had crossed the Rhine. But why would Tarr defy orders from Schaef to have Ambros arrested? While soldiers with the 6th Army stood scratching their heads in Gendorf, Tarr and Ambros were actually headed to Heidelberg in a U.S. Army jeep. Their destination was an American interrogation center that was run by Army intelligence officers with the Chemical Warfare Service. For days, no one at Dustbin had any idea where Tarr and Ambros had gone. Otto Ambros had a razor-sharp mind. He was cunning and congenial, sly like a fox. He almost always wore a grin. The American war crimes prosecutor Josiah Dubois described him as having a devilish friendliness about him. He also had a distracting, rabbit-like habit of sniffing at the air. Ambros was short and heavy-set, with white hair and flat feet. He was a brilliant scientist who studied chemistry and agronomy under Nobel Prize winner Richard Willstetter, a Jew. As a chemist, Ambros had a mind that was capable of pushing science into realms previously unexplored. Few men were as important to I.G. Farben during the war as Otto Ambros had been. I.G. Farben first began producing synthetic rubber in 1935, naming it Buna after its primary component, butadiene. In 1937 Farben presented commercial Buna on the world stage and won the gold medal at the International Expo in Paris. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, the Reich's ability to import natural rubber diminished. Demand for a synthetic alternative skyrocketed, a fact Farben was well aware of in advance of Germany's attack. Tanks needed treads, aircraft needed tires, and Farben needed to produce rubber. Hitler directed Farben to increase its Buna production further. Dr. Ambros was put in charge and saw to it that Farben opened a second and then a third Buna plant so that supply could meet demand. As the invasion of the Soviet Union was secretly conceived by the German High Command, Hitler again called upon Farben's board of directors to increase its synthetic rubber production. Farben needed to construct a massive new Buna factory. Otto Ambros was put in charge of masterminding this undertaking as well. The place chosen was Auschwitz. Once, Auschwitz was a regular town. Ordinary people lived there, and tourists visited to see the castle, the churches, the large medieval market square, and the synagogue, write historians Deborah Dwork and Robert Jan van Pelt. In the 1930s, visitors sent postcards from the area that read "Greetings from Auschwitz." When, in the fall of 1940, Otto Ambros pored over maps of this region, called Upper Silesia, in search of a Buna factory site, he found what he was looking for. The production of synthetic rubber required four things: water, flat land, good railway connections, and an abundance of laborers. Auschwitz had all four. Three rivers met in Auschwitz, the Sola, the Vistula, and the Pierzemsa, with a water flow of 525,000 cubic feet per hour. The land was flat and 65 feet above the waterline, making it safe from flood waters. The railway connections were sound. But most important was the labor issue. The concentration camp next door could provide an endless labor supply because the men were cheap and could be worked to death. For Farben, the use of slave labor could take the company to levels of economic prowess previously unexplored. First, a financial deal had to be made with the SS. Ambrose was instrumental in this act. For months, before the building of the Buna factory got the go-ahead, the SS and Farben haggled over deal points. Some of the paperwork survived the war. On November 8, 1940, the Reichsminister of Economics wrote to Farben's board of directors, requesting that they hurry up and settle the question regarding the site. Otto Ambrose lobbied hard for Auschwitz, and in December, IG Farben sent a busload of its rubber experts and construction workers to survey the worksite. A Farben employee named Eric Santo was assigned to serve as Otto Ambrose's construction foreman. The concentration camp already existing with approximately 7,000 prisoners is to be expanded, Santo noted in his official company report. For Ambrose, Farben's arrangement with the SS regarding slave laborers remained vague. Ambrose sought clarity. It is therefore necessary to open negotiations with the Reich leader SS as soon as possible in order to discuss necessary measures with him, Ambrose wrote in his official company report. The two men had a decades-old relationship. Heinrich Himmler and Otto Ambrose had known one another since grade school. Ambrose could make Himmler see eye to eye with him on the benefits that Auschwitz offered to both Farben and the SS. In fact, the SS and IG Farben needed one another. Himmler wanted Farben's resources at Auschwitz and was eager to make the deal to supply the slaves, so SS officers hosted a dinner party for Farben's rubber and construction experts at the Auschwitz concentration camp, inside an SS banquet hall there. During the festivities, the remaining issues were finally agreed upon. Farben would pay the SS 3 Reichsmarks a day for each laborer they supplied, which would go into the SS treasury, not to the slaves. On the occasion of a dinner party given for us by the management of the concentration camp, we furthermore determined all the arrangements relating to the involvement of the really excellent concentration camp operation in support of the Buna plants, Ambrose wrote to his boss, Fritz Termeer, on April 12, 1941. Our new friendship with the SS is proving very profitable, Ambrose explained. The SS agreed to provide Farben with 1,000 slave workers immediately. That number, promised Himmler, could quickly rise to 30,000 with demand. The relationship between Farben and the SS at Auschwitz was now cemented. Otto Ambrose was the key to making the Buna factory a success. With his knowledge of synthetic rubber and his managerial experience, he also ran Farben's secret nerve gas production facilities. There was no better man than Otto Ambrose for the Auschwitz job. Major Tilly waited at dustbin for the return of Tar and Ambrose. It was now clear to him that there was no single individual more important to Hitler's chemical weapons program than Otto Ambrose had been. Ambrose was in charge of chemical weapons at Gendorf and Die Herrenfurth, and he was the manager of the Buna factory at Auschwitz. From interviewing various Farben chemists held at dustbin, Tilly had also learned that the gas used to murder millions of people at Auschwitz and other concentration camps, Zyklon B, was a Farben product. Farben owned the patent on Zyklon B, and it was sold to the Reich by an IG Farben company. In one of these interviews, Tilly asked IG Farben board member Baron George von Schnitzler if Otto Ambrose knew that Farben chemicals were being used to murder people. You said yesterday that I alluded to you that the poisonous gases and the chemicals manufactured by IG Farben were being used for the murder of human beings held in concentration camps, Major Tilly reminded von Schnitzler in their interview. So I understood him, von Schnitzler replied. Didn't you question those employees of yours further in regard to the use of these gases? They said they knew it was being used for this purpose, von Schnitzler said. What did you do when he told you that IG chemicals were being used to kill, to murder people held in concentration camps? Major Tilly asked. I was horrified, said von Schnitzler. Did you do anything about it? I kept it for me because it was too terrible, von Schnitzler confessed. I asked, is it known to you and Ambrose and other directors in Auschwitz that the gases and chemicals are being used to murder people? What did he say? Asked Major Tilly. Yes, it is known to all the IG directors in Auschwitz, von Schnitzler said. For Lieutenant Colonel Philip R. Tarr, there was a mission at hand. Enemy Equipment Intelligence Service Team No. 1, which he served on, needed information that only Dr. Otto Ambrose had. Specifically, the team needed blueprints for equipment necessary for producing Tabun nerve gas. When Tarr and Ambrose arrived in Heidelberg, the U.S. Chemical Warfare Service had another IG Farben chemist in custody whom they wanted Ambrose to work with on a classified job. The man is referred to in documents only as Herr Stumpfe. Ambrose and Stumpfe were told to drive to a special metals firm located in Hanau, where they were to locate 30 or 40 drawings of silver-lined equipment. The Chemical Warfare Service trusted Ambrose to such a degree that they sent him and Stumpfe on this mission without an escort. Manufacturing Tabun gas was a precise and clandestine process. The United States desperately wanted to reproduce it, but attempting to do so without Farben's proprietary formula and its secret equipment was a potential death sentence for any chemists involved. Farben had spent millions of Reichsmarks on research and development. Hundreds of concentration camp workers had died in this trial and error process. When the U.S. Chemical Warfare Service learned that the silver-lined equipment used to manufacture Tabun gas on a large scale had been outsourced from a special metals firm called Heros, they coveted those blueprints and plans. Dr. Ambrose and Herr Stumpfe were to go to this engineering firm to locate these drawings and blueprints and bring them back to Heidelberg. The Chemical Warfare Service agents could not conduct this mission on their own because they had no idea what equipment to look for. The two Farben chemists, Ambrose and Stumpfe, set off on their secret assignment. When they arrived at the factory in Hanau, personnel of a CIC group with headquarters at that time in Hanau, arrested them, read a secret report. When they explained their mission, the CIC personnel concerned confirmed the German engineer's statement by communication with Heidelberg, and the two Germans were released. Ambrose and Stumpfe drove away. The CIC personnel, concerned having learned of the drawings through the two German engineers, then seized the drawings and took them to their own headquarters, read a classified army report. The Chemical Warfare Service never obtained the drawings they were looking for. But at least Tarr had Dr. Ambrose under his control, or so he believed. Instead, somewhere between Ambrose's release from the Heros engineering firm in Hanau and his return to Heidelberg, he was able to communicate to his network of spies and informants in Gendorf. From those sources, Ambrose learned that soldiers with the U.S. 6th Army had an order to arrest him. So instead of returning to Tarr's custody, Ambrose drove to a fancy guest house that IG Farben maintained outside Heidelberg called Villa Kohlhoff, where a staff of Farben employees tended to his every need. CIOs and Fiat officials from Dustbin finally made contact with Tarr and ordered him to return with Ambrose to the interrogation facility immediately. But Tarr was no longer in control of Ambrose. Major Tilly went looking for Ambrose himself and found Hitler's chemist residing at Villa Kohlhoff. Ambrose told Major Tilly that he would agree to continue cooperating with the U.S. Chemical Warfare Service and the various Allied agencies that sought information from him, but only on one condition, that Tilly secure the release of all chemical warfare personnel already detained at Dustbin. This was a preposterous request. Tilly's superior, Major P.M. Wilson of Fiat's Enemy Personnel Exploitation Section, attempted to take control of the situation, ordering Ambrose brought to Dustbin immediately. This was not a matter of cooperation, Wilson said. There were orders to arrest the man. Lieutenant Colonel Tarr intervened on Ambrose's behalf. He lobbied the British Ministry of Supply for help getting Ambrose's Dustbin colleagues released. To Tarr, extracting Ambrose's esoteric knowledge outweighed the need to hold him accountable for his crimes. But the British also flatly refused to help Tarr. The matter stalled. Lieutenant Colonel Tarr flew to Paris. That night, a telegram arrived at Dustbin, sent from Paris and purporting to be from the British Ministry of Supply. The telegram ordered the release of all Farben chemical warfare scientists at Dustbin, and was signed by a British Ministry of Supply colonel named J.T.M. Childs. Officers at Dustbin suspected that something was amiss and contacted Colonel Childs about his outrageous request. Colonel Childs swore he had neither written the memo nor signed it and accused Lieutenant Colonel Tarr of forgery. Fiat enhanced their efforts to have Dr. Ambrose arrested in Heidelberg. The efforts failed. Ambrose was able to evade capture by fleeing into the safety of the French zone. Double-crossing Lieutenant Colonel Tarr, Otto Ambrose struck a deal with French chemical weapons experts. In exchange for information, he was given a job as plant manager at Farben's chemical factory in Ludwigshafen. When Fiat officers at Dustbin learned what had happened, they were outraged. Ambrose's escape had been entirely preventable. It is evident that he was not kept in custody or under house arrest, noted Captain R.E.F. Edelsten, a British officer with the Ministry of Supply. Major P.M. Wilson saw the situation in much darker terms. Lieutenant Colonel Tarr had taken steps to assist to evade arrest, he wrote in a scathing report. Wilson was appalled by the friendly treatment being given to this man who is suspected of war criminality. But these were just words. Ambrose was now a free man, living and working in the French zone. The relationship among Tarr, Ambrose, and the U.S. Chemical Warfare Service was far from over. It was only a matter of time before an American chemical company would learn of the Army's interest in a whole new field of chemical weapons. An American chemist, Dr. Wilhelm Hirschkind, was in Germany at this same time. Dr. Hirschkind was conducting a survey of the German chemical industry for the U.S. Chemical Warfare Service while on temporary leave from the Dow Chemical Company. Dr. Hirschkind had spent several months inspecting IG Farben plants in the US and British zones, and now he was in Heidelberg, hoping to meet Ambrose. Lieutenant Colonel Tarr reached out to Colonel Weiss, the French commander in charge of IG Farben's chemical plant in Ludwigshafen, and a meeting was arranged. On July 28, 1945, Dr. Hirschkind met with Dr. Ambrose and Lieutenant Colonel Tarr in Heidelberg. Ambrose brought his wartime deputy with him to the meeting, the Farben chemist Jürgen von Klink. It was von Klink who, in the final months of the war, had helped Ambrose destroy evidence, hide documents, and disguise the Farben factory in Gendorf so that it appeared to produce soap, not chemical weapons. Jürgen von Klink was initially detained at Dustbin but later released. The Heidelberg meetings lasted several days. When Dr. Wilhelm Hirschkind left, he had these words for Ambrose: "I would look forward after the conclusion of the peace treaty continuing our relations as a representative of Dow." Only later did Fiat interrogators learn about this meeting. Major Tilley's suspicions were now confirmed. A group inside the U.S. Chemical Warfare Service, including his former partner, Lieutenant Colonel Tarr, did indeed have an ulterior motive that ran counter to the motives of CIOs, Fiat, and the United Nations War Crimes Commission. Tilley's superior at Dustbin, Major Wilson, confirmed this dark and disturbing truth in a classified military intelligence report on the Ambrose affair. It is believed that the conflict between Fiat and LTCOL Tarr was due to the latter's wish to use Ambrose for industrial chemical purposes back in the United States. All documents regarding the Ambrose affair would remain classified for the next 40 years, until August of 1985. That an officer of the U.S. Chemical Warfare Service, Lieutenant Colonel Tarr, had sheltered a wanted war criminal from capture in the aftermath of the German surrender was damning. That this officer was also participating in meetings with the fugitive and a representative from the Dow Chemical Company was scandalous. In 1945, the Chemical Warfare Service was also in charge of the U.S. biological weapons program, the existence of which remained secret from the American public. The program was robust. If the atomic bomb failed to end the war in Japan, there were plans in motion to wage biological warfare against Japanese crops. After the fall of the Reich, the staff of the Chemical Warfare Service began interrogating Hitler's biological weapons makers, many of whom were interned at Dustbin. The Chemical Warfare Service saw enormous potential in making the Nazis' biological weapons program its own and sought any scientific intelligence it could get. The man most wanted in this effort was Hitler's top biological weapons expert, Dr. Kurt Blome. On June 29, 1945, Blome was sent to dustbin. The officers assigned to interrogate him were Bill Cromarty and J. M. Barnes of Operation Alsos. Each man was uniquely familiar with Blome's background. Cromarty had been in Dr. Eugen Hagen's apartment in Strasbourg in November 1944 when he and also scientific director Samuel Goudsmit made the awful discovery that the Reich had been experimenting on people during the war. And it was Cromarty and Barnes who led the investigation of the Garaberg facility, the abandoned, curious-looking research outpost hidden in the Thuringian forest. Both Cromarty and Barnes had concluded that Garaberg had been a laboratory for Reich biological weapons research and that Dr. Blome was in charge. During his initial interview at Dustbin, Blome refused to cooperate. When he was first interrogated, he was very evasive, Cromarty and Barnes wrote. But a few days later, when interrogated in more detail, Blome's attitude changed completely and he seemed anxious to give a full account not only what he actually did but what he had in mind for future work. Cromarty and Barnes were unsure if they should be enthused by Blome's seeming change of heart or suspicious of it. Blome had been observed in the dustbin eating hall conversing at length with Dr. Heinrich Kleiwe, the Reich's counterintelligence agent for bacterial warfare concerns. Perhaps the two men were concocting a misinformation scheme. During the war, Dr. Kleiwe's job had been to monitor bioweapons progress being made by Germany's enemies, most notably Russia. Kleiwe claims that he himself did all the evaluating of the reports received and determined what course of action his department should thenceforth follow, investigators wrote in Kleiwe's dustbin dossier. Kleiwe told Blome that he would likely be taken to Heidelberg for a lengthy interrogation with Alsos agents, as Kleiwe had been. If Cromarty and Barnes were surprised by Blome's sudden willingness to talk, they were also aware that most of what he told them could not be independently verified. It is quite impossible to check many of his statements, and what follows is an account of what he related, read a note in Blome's dustbin dossier. What Blome recounted was a dark tale of plans for biological warfare spearheaded by Heinrich Himmler. Himmler had a layman's fascination with biological warfare. A former chicken farmer, the Reichsführer SS had studied agriculture in school. According to Blome, it was Himmler who was the primary motivator behind the Reich's bioweapons program. Hitler, Blome said, did not approve of biological warfare and was kept in the dark as to specific plans. Himmler's area of greatest fascination, said Blome, was bubonic plague. On April 30, 1943, Göring had created the cancer research post that was to be held by Blome. Over the next 19 months, Blome explained, he met with Himmler 5 times. At their first meeting, which occurred in the summer of 1943, Blome recalled it as being July or August. Himmler ordered Blome to study various dissemination methods of plague bacteria for offensive warfare. According to Blome, he shared with Himmler his fears regarding the dangerous boomerang effect a plague bomb would most likely have on Germany. Himmler told Blome that in that case, he should get to work immediately to produce a vaccine to prevent such a thing. To expedite vaccine research, Blome said, Himmler ordered him to use human beings. Himmler offered Blome a medical block at a concentration camp like Dachau where he could complete this work. Blome said he told Himmler he was aware of strong objections in certain circles to using humans in experimental vaccine trials. Himmler told Blome that experimenting on humans was necessary in the war effort. To refuse was the equivalent of treason. Very well, said Blome. He considered himself a loyal Nazi, and it was his intention to help Germany win the war. History gives us examples of human disease affecting the outcome of wars, Blome told his Alsos interrogators, taking a moment to lecture them on history. We know from antiquity up till the time of Napoleonic wars, victories and defeats were often determined by epidemics and starvation, Blome said. Spreading an infectious disease could bring about the demise of a marauding army, and Blome said that the failure of Napoleon's Russian campaign was due in great part to the infection of his horses with glanders, a highly contagious bacterial disease. History aside, Blome said he counseled Himmler on the fact that a concentration camp was a terrible place to experiment with bubonic plague because the population was too dense. Blome then told Himmler that if he were to experiment with plague bacterium, he would need his own institute, an isolated facility far removed from population centers. Himmler and Blome agreed that Poland would be a good place, and they settled on Naselstedt, a small town outside the former Poznan University. Blome's research institute was to be called the Bacteriological Institute at Naselstedt. In the interim, in Berlin, Blome oversaw a field test using rats, history's traditional carrier of bubonic plague. A debate had been taking place inside the Hygiene Institute of the Waffen-SS as to whether or not rats were the best plague carriers. Himmler's idea was to take infected rats onto U-boats and release them near the enemy shore so they could swim to land. Blome doubted that rats could swim great distances. He believed they could swim only for as long as the air in their fur kept them afloat. To prove his point, Blome arranged for a test on a Berlin lake. About 30 rats were taken out in a police boat and released at different distances from the shore to swim both with and against the wind. Blome said that the rats were dumber than he thought, that when placed in the water, they had no idea where the shore was and swam around in different directions. A few of them drowned in 10 minutes. The longest any of the rats swam for was 30 minutes. Of those released a little over a half-mile from shore, only a third reached land. As far as Blome was concerned, Himmler's U-boat dispersal idea was not practical. Meeting number 2 took place a month or two later, in September or October 1943, and was largely a repetition of the first, at least according to Blome. There was one significant development, however. Himmler asked Blome if he needed an assistant. Blome agreed that a bacteriologist would be helpful. Himmler assigned Dr. Karl Gross, formerly a staff member at the Waffen-SS Hygiene Institute. The two doctors did not get along. Blome became convinced that Dr. Gross had been sent by Himmler to spy on him. He told his interrogators that he was under great pressure to work faster. Himmler repeatedly reiterated that the methods of waging BW must be studied in order to understand the defense against it. What this meant was that Himmler wanted Blome to infect human test subjects with plague to see what would happen to them. The third meeting took place 4 or 5 months later, in February 1944. By this time, Blome said, the facility at Naselstedt had been built. There was ample staff housing, a well-equipped laboratory, and an animal farm. The block for experimental work included a climate room, a cold room, disinfectant facilities, and rooms for clean and dirty experiments. There was an isolation hospital for 16 people in the event that workers on Blome's staff contracted the disease. Work progressed slowly, Blome said, and Himmler became enraged. Rumors of an Allied invasion of the European continent had become a constant thorn in the side of the Reichsführer SS. Why wasn't the Reich's bioweapons program more advanced? Himmler demanded to know. He asked Blome if it was possible to do something now, for example disseminate influenza that would delay the heralded Anglo-American invasion in the West. According to Blome, he told Himmler it was impossible to do anything on these lines. Himmler proposed another idea: how about disseminating a virulent strain of hoof and mouth disease? Ortuluremia, also called rabbit fever, which affected man in a manner similar to plague. Blome told Himmler that these were dangerous ideas, as any outbreak would surely affect Germany's troops. The Reich needed a massive stockpile of vaccinations before it could feasibly launch a biological attack. Himmler stretched his thinking to target the Allies on their own soil. How about spreading cattle plague, also called Rinderpest, in America or England? Himmler told Blome that infecting the enemy's food supply would have a sinister effect on enemy troops. Blome agreed and said he would investigate what it would take to start a plague epidemic among the enemy's cows. There was, however, a problem, Blome explained. An international agreement prohibited stocks of the rinderpest virus to be stored anywhere in Europe. Strains of cattle plague were available only in the Third World. Himmler said that he would get the cattle plague himself. He sent Dr. Erich Traub, a veterinarian from the Reich State Research Institute, located on the island of Reims, to Turkey. There, Dr. Traub acquired a strain of the lethal rinderpest virus. Under Blom's direction, trials to infect healthy cows with rinderpest began. Reims, in northern Germany in the Bay of Greifswald, was totally isolated and self-contained. It was the perfect place for these dangerous tests. The veterinary section used airplanes to spray the cattle plague virus on the island's grassy fields, where cows grazed. Blom said he didn't know much more about the program or its results, only that Dr. Traub, second in command at the research facility, was taken by the Russians when the Red Army captured Reims, in April 1945. Blom's fourth meeting with Himmler took place in April or May of 1944. Himmler had become paranoid by now, Blom said. He believed that the Allies were plotting a biological weapons attack against the Reich. Blom was summoned by telephone to see Himmler urgently. The latter had received a number of curious reports. Grass had come floating out of the sky over some part of Austria and a cow that had eaten some of it had died. Blom told Himmler he'd look into it. There were additional strange events, Himmler confided to Blom. Some small balloons had been found near Salzburg and Berchtesgaden, not far from Hitler's mountain residence, the Berghof. And potato beetles had been dropped in Normandy. Blom promised to study each incident. Blom told Himmler he had a pressing issue of his own. Given the progress of the Red Army, he thought it was wise to move his plague research institute at Posen somewhere inside Germany. The place Blom suggested was Garaberg, in the Thuringian forest, at the edge of the Harz Mountains. Himmler said that the Russians would never reach Posen. By early fall, he had changed his mind. In October, a new biological weapons research facility was being built, concealed inside a pine forest in the village of Garaberg. In the meantime, Blom told his interrogators, work on vaccines was moving forward not at either of his research institutes but inside the army instead. Göring had moved epidemic control into the jurisdiction of a major general named Dr. Walter Schreiber, Surgeon General of the Reich. Blom held the position of Deputy Surgeon General of the Reich, but the two men had equal positions under Göring, Blom explained. He, Blom, was in charge of creating the biological weapons, Dr. Schreiber was in charge of protecting Germans against biological weapons, should they be used. Major General Dr. Schreiber specialized in epidemic control. The Sword and the Shield. Alsos was very interested in learning about these vaccines. Blom said that Major General Dr. Schreiber was the person to talk to about that. Where could he be found? Blom said Schreiber had last been seen in Berlin. Word was he had surrendered to the Red Army and was their prisoner now. Blom said something else that alarmed interrogators. During the war, Dr. Kleiwe told Blom that it was the Russians who had the single most extensive biological weapons program in the world, a program more advanced even than that of the Japanese. Further, the Russians had managed to capture everything from Dr. Traub's laboratory on Reims, including Dr. Traub's Turkish strain of cattle plague. Then, in the winter of 1945, the Russians had captured Blom's bacteriological institute at Nisselstedt, outside Posen. This meant the Russians now had the Reich's most advanced biological weapons research and development facility, its steam chambers, incubators, refrigerators, and deep freeze apparatus. They also had all of the pathogens, viral and bacterial, that Blom had been working with when he had fled west. Alsos had two key pieces of information now: the Russians had the laboratory from Posen and they had the doctor in charge of vaccines, Major General Dr. Walter Schreiber. They had both the science and the scientist. Chapter 10. Hired or hanged? The future of the scientists at Dustbin was obscure. Would they be hired by the US government for future work, or would they be prosecuted by the Allies for war crimes? At Ashken, the future facing the Nazi high command was almost certainly grim, although there was much work to do. War crimes prosecutors faced a monumental task. They had to build criminal cases from scratch, a conundrum described by Nuremberg trials prosecutor General Telford Taylor after the war. Our task was to prepare to prosecute the leading Nazis on criminal charges. The first question a prosecuting attorney asks in such a situation is, where's the evidence? The blunt fact was that, despite what everybody knew about the Nazi leaders, virtually no judicially admissible evidence was at hand. For evidence, prosecutors like Telford Taylor were relying on interrogators like John Doleboy to glean facts from the Nazis interned at Ashcan. Frustration was mounting at Ashcan. Prisoners were conspiring to withhold information. They were whispering rather important secrets to each other. Ashcan's commander, Colonel Burton Andrus, recalled, determined not to help on the question of hidden loot, the whereabouts of people like Martin Bormann, and the guilt for war atrocities. Colonel Andrus racked his brain for ideas. How to make guilty men talk. To jog the prisoners' memories back to the reality of their grave situation, we decided to show them atrocity films taken at Buchenwald. Colonel Andrus assembled his 52 Nazi prisoners in one room. Before the film began, he addressed them with the following words: "You know about these things, and I have no doubt many of you participated actively in them. We are showing them to you not to inform you of what you already know, but to impress on you the fact that we know of it, too." The lights went down and the first frames of the documentary footage flickered across the screen. Colonel Andrus watched his prisoners. Hans Frank, Governor-General of occupied Poland, the lawyer and PhD largely responsible for the murder of the Jewish population there, put a handkerchief to his mouth and gagged. Joachim von Ribbentrop, the former champagne salesman who became Hitler's foreign minister and pressured foreign states to allow the deportation of Jews in their territories to extermination camps in the East, got up from his chair and walked out of the room. Albert Kesselring, commander of the Luftwaffe invasions into Poland, France, and the Soviet Union, who also led the Battle of Britain, turned white. Hermann Göring sighed as if bored. Julius Streicher, the schoolteacher who became Hitler's mouthpiece and encouraged readers to exterminate the Jews, sat on his chair clasping and unclasping his hands. When the film was over, no one said a word. A little while later, Walter Funk, the 55-year-old former Minister of the War Economy and President of the Reichsbank, asked to see Colonel Andrus alone. Small, overweight, and suffering from venereal disease, this once supremely powerful Nazi Party official twisted his fingers anxiously, while telling Colonel Andrus he had a confession to make. Walter Funk looked incapable of running a filling station, let alone a bank, Andrus recalled. Funk fidgeted nervously. "I have something to tell you, sir," Andrus recalled Funk saying. "I have been a bad man, Colonel, and I want to tell about it." Funk started to cry. Then he told Colonel Andrus that it was he who gave the order that all gold in every prisoner's mouth in every concentration camp across the Reich be removed and collected for the Reichsbank's reserves. Funk confessed that at first he'd had knocked out of their mouths while they were alive, but if they were dead there was far less bother. Andrus was appalled. "I had never believed before that such a horrific order as the one Funk was confessing to had ever been given," Andrus said. Colonel Andrus told Funk to leave. In his memoir, Andrus wondered what Walter Funk had hoped to gain from his confession. He never got his answer. Whatever motivated Funk that day at Ashcan eventually disappeared. Months later, at Nuremberg, Funk denied that the conversation with Colonel Andrus had ever taken place. Instead, he swore under oath that he had never been connected with orders involving acquiring gold from Jews. "If it was done," declared Funk, "it has been kept from me up till now." Save Funk's tearful confession, the screening of the Buchenwald atrocity film had no apparent effect on the other prisoners. The men who gagged and left the room had nothing more to say, and the rest of the Nazi high command remained tight-lipped about their crimes. Colonel Andrus grew increasingly frustrated. The prisoners were allowed to sit outside in the Palace Hotel garden, in small groups out of earshot of prison guards. There, Andrus watched Hitler's closest confidants prattle on among themselves. They could sit out in the garden in the spring sunshine and chatter to their heart's content, recalled Andrus. Undoubtedly they compared notes on the interrogation which went on in 16 booths every day. If only G2 had wired the Ashcan garden for sound. Colonel Andrus got an idea. He made a list of the 4 men who he believed were the biggest backstabbers and gossips in the group. Those with outspoken views about their fellow Nazis, men ready to blame each other for their own crimes. Göring, verbose, von Papen, malicious, Kesselring, vain, and Admiral Horthy, the Prince of Austria who believed he was better than everyone else, were chosen. With permission from headquarters, Andrus devised an elaborate ruse intended to extract information from the Nazi prisoners. The 4 men were told that they were being handed over to the British for interrogation, that soon they would be traveling to a villa in Germany to be questioned there. In reality, Army Intelligence, G2, had rented a house located 3.5 miles from Ashcan. It was a traditional German-style half-timber house with a high wall running around its perimeter. U.S. Army signal intelligence engineers spent several days running hundreds of yards of wires through the house, under floorboards, behind walls, inside furniture cushions and lighting fixtures. In a final touch, they wired the garden for sound. The engineers burrowed through the backyard garden and attached tiny microphones to a single tree above the sitting area. All wires connected back to a recording machine capable of laying audio tracks down onto gramophone records. This was high technology in the summer of 1945. At the Ashcan Detention Center, Göring, von Papen, Kesselring, and Admiral Horthy were loaded into an ambulance, a common means of transport after the war, and driven away. Black curtains had been drawn across the vehicle windows so the prisoners couldn't see where they were being taken. For hours, the ambulance drove around in what Andrus called a circuitous route, covering 50 miles of terrain but never leaving Luxembourg. When the ambulance pulled up to the Germanic-looking house and unloaded the Nazis, Göring was thrilled. "We are at a house I know," boasted Göring, assuring his colleagues they had arrived in beautiful Heidelberg. "I recognize the decor on the walls," Göring said once inside. The bedrooms in the new quarters had fresh sheets, plush mattresses, and soft pillows. Strolling through the house, Göring pointed to a chandelier and warned his fellow Nazis to be wary of listening devices. When one of the prisoners asked if they could sit outside in the garden, a guard checked with a superior and said yes. Göring made note of a single patch of shade under a weeping willow tree and suggested it as a good spot. The men dragged 4 garden chairs into the shade, sat down, and began to gossip. Heavy, guttural voices could be heard loud and clear, Andrus recalled. They were being recorded onto the black gramophone discs. It was a brilliant start. But only a start. Soon, it began to rain. The men moved inside. There, they sat around barely saying a word. The following day, it rained again. That evening, Colonel Andrus received an order from Schaeff. The eavesdropping project was being shut down. Andrus had 24 hours to pack up his prisoners and leave. This time the ambulance took the direct route back to Mondorf, just 3.5 miles away. Göring was furious, Andrus recalled. How could they have gotten back to the prison so quickly? They realized they'd been had. Back at Ashcan, things moved in a whirlwind. John Doleboy received a letter of authority on August 10, 1945, stating that QI number 32 was going to be closed down. Doleboy was to be part of the transport team now taking prisoners to new locations. For reasons Doleboy was not privy to, 33 of the 52 Ashcan internees were going to a new prisoner of war interrogation facility, this one located in the small town of Oberursel in the Taunus Mountains. Only later would Doleboy learn that many of these Nazis would be hired by the U.S. Army to write intelligence reports on work they had done during the war. Oberursel was just a few miles from the dustbin facility at Kassel Kronsberg. The transport would be a convoy of 6 ambulances, a command car, a jeep, a trailer, and a truck carrying the prisoners' suitcases. Doloboy was assigned to ride in the first ambulance. His prisoner list included Admiral Karl Dönitz, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, General Walter Warlimont, Cabinet Minister Schwerin von Krosigk, OKW Foreign Office Head Admiral Leopold Berner, and Admiral Gerhard Wagner. The trip from Mondorf to Oberursel was a journey through ruined countryside. Crossing from Luxembourg into Germany, Doloboy watched the chatter among the Nazis in his back seat come to a halting end as they saw the destruction and despair everywhere. This was their first look at the condition of their country since the war, Doloboy explained. From churches to administrative buildings to shops, entire villages had been reduced to rubble. In 3 months of peace there were no resources to clean anything up. People were starving and trying to survive. The destruction that was the aftermath of Hitler's determination to fight to the last man, said Doloboy. The convoy arrived in Oberursel. Like many other army interrogation facilities across the American zone in post-war Germany, the one in Oberursel had been an important Third Reich military post during the war. Oberursel had a particularly storied past. This Stalag Luft, or Durchgangslager, had functioned as the sole interrogation and evaluation center for the Luftwaffe. It was here that Nazi interrogators had questioned every Allied pilot who had been shot down during the war. The Luftwaffe's lead interrogator, Hans Scharf, kept a diary. Every enemy aviator who is captured, will be brought to this place for questioning. It makes no difference whether he is taken prisoner at the front lines or whether he comes dangling down from the sky in the most remote location, he comes to Oberursel, wrote Scharf. Physically, things had not changed much since Oberursel had changed hands. The interrogation facility centered around a large half-timber mountain house that served as an officers' club. Nearby there were 14 buildings for officer housing. The prisoners' barracks, a large U-shaped building, contained 150 solitary jail cells. This building had been called the Cooler during the war, and it was the place where interrogator Hans Scharf did most of his work with captured Allied pilots. Now it was the new home for 33 former Ashcan internees, at least for a while. Doloboy turned his charges over to the guard detail at Oberursel. His orders said to return to Luxembourg and wait for new orders. Setting out for Ashcan, he rode in the lead jeep with an enlisted man. A little less than an hour south of Frankfurt, Doloboy came upon a row of U.S. Army trucks stopped along the side of the road. One of the soldiers stepped into the road and signaled for Doloboy's convoy to stop. John Doloboy climbed out of his jeep. He became overwhelmed by a horrific stench, sickeningly sweet, nauseating, he later recalled. He heard retching. Several of the men in his convoy had gotten out of their vehicles and were now throwing up along the side of the road. What is that horrible smell? Doloboy asked a soldier behind the wheel of one of the stalled vehicles. What in God's name are you hauling? The captain climbed out of his jeep. He did not say a word but motioned for Doloboy to follow him behind one of the 2.5-ton trucks. In silence, the captain untied a rope and flipped back a sheet of canvas that had obscured the cargo from view until now. Doloboy stared into the body of the truck. It took him a moment for him to realize what he was looking at, rotting corpses. Putrefied, he recalled. Most were naked. Some still wore the pajama-like striped pants, the concentration camp uniforms, now just rotting rags. It was the most horrible sight I had ever seen. The army captain spoke in a flat, emotionless tone. There are thousands of them, 5 truckloads, he told Doloboy. We're hauling them from one mass grave to another. Don't ask me why. These were bodies from Dachau. Corpses found upon liberation. The army captain's convoy had come to a standstill after one of the vehicles had broken down. They'd been waiting at the roadside for an escort when Doloboy's convoy from Oberursel had arrived. The captain asked Doloboy if his group could escort them to the next military station down the road. Doloboy agreed. I found myself leading a bizarre caravan, 6 empty ambulances, an empty weapons carrier, followed by 5 2.5-ton trucks loaded with the obscenity of the Nazi final solution, remembered Doloboy. The dead bodies were being taken to a proper burial spot on orders from the Office of Military Government, United States. Back at Ashcan the world appeared different to him now. There, the rest of Hitler's inner circle remained, men directly responsible for that ghastly transport, said Doloboy. If John Doloboy ever had a shred of doubt about the degree of barbarism and the collective guilt of the men he had spent 3 months interrogating at Ashcan, in that moment there was no hesitation anymore. At age 93, John Doloboy says, "I still smell that foul odor of death." But in August 1945, there was barely any time for the young interrogator to process what he had witnessed. Back at Ashcan he fell into bed and slept hard. Come morning, John Doloboy received new orders from Colonel Andrus. There was still a group of Nazi Bonzen at Ashcan. Doloboy was to be on the team that would move them to the Nuremberg prison. Colonel Andrus had selected John Doloboy to fly with the remaining members of the Nazi High Command on a transport plane. Dawn, August 12, 1945. The sun had not yet risen in the sky. Ashcan's last group of Nazis were escorted out of the classified interrogation facility and driven in ambulances a short distance to the airport at Luxembourg City. A C-47 transport plane idled on the tarmac, stripped down to its bare bones. Inside the aircraft, a single row of seats ran down each side. There was a honey bucket toilet and a urinal attached to a door at the back of the airplane. To Doloboy, it seemed as if Colonel Andrus was nervous. Something was cooking, Doloboy recalled. Security was always on the colonel's mind. Aha! Doloboy realized what it was. Kaltenbrunner. Ernst Kaltenbrunner was considered the most dangerous Nazi among the high command. At 6'4", he was a giant man with a massive frame, a pockmarked face, and a huge head with 7 or 8 deep dueling scars running across both sides of his forehead, cheeks, and chin. He drank and smoked heavily and was missing teeth. Kaltenbrunner was described by the British journalist Rebecca West as looking like a particularly vicious horse. He held a doctorate in law and specialized in secret police work. He was the head of the Reich Security Main Office and chief of the security police and the security services. He was as actively involved in concentration camp crimes as any Nazi had been. According to the OSS, even Heinrich Himmler was frightened of him. If anyone was going to cause trouble on the flight to Nuremberg, Doloboy explains, Colonel Andrus was worried that Ernst Kaltenbrunner might. Special precautions needed to be taken. Kaltenbrunner would be handcuffed to Doloboy's left wrist. If he starts to run or goes for the door, Colonel Andrus told Doloboy, shoot. Colonel Andrus wished John Doloboy good luck during the flight and said that he would see him once they landed in Nuremberg. Colonel Andrus would be traveling in a different airplane. During the flight Kaltenbrunner did not run for the door. Instead, he wanted to talk. He told Doloboy that he desired for the young interrogator to understand that he, Kaltenbrunner, was not responsible for war crimes. He felt the need to explain about the Jews, Doloboy recalled, with Kaltenbrunner saying, admittedly, he hated them, but he said that he had not been involved in their treatment in concentration camps. In fact, he claimed to have remonstrated with Hitler on the treatment of the Jews. As the airplane prepared to land in Nuremberg, Kaltenbrunner said what so many Nazis repeated after the war. I am a soldier and I only obeyed orders, he told Doloboy. I didn't argue with him, I just listened, Doloboy said. Kaltenbrunner was a ruthless killer determined to save his own skin. His soft talk did not change my mind about him, but it helped pass the time. When the aircraft finally touched the ground, Doloboy felt a huge wave of relief. The prisoners were unloaded, and Colonel Andrus assumed control of them once again. Without looking back, Doloboy hurried onto the transport plane. The plane taxied down the runway and took flight. Doloboy sat alone in the empty airplane. The weeks of interrogating the Nazi high command were over. The Nazis he had just flown with would now be tried for war crimes at the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg. A majority of them would be hanged. Back at Ashcan, when Dolaboy returned to his quarters to pack his bags, he came across a strange sight. Standing by the edge of the perimeter fence, not far from where Dolaboy had first pulled up to this place in an army jeep 3 months before, he spotted a middle-aged man, apparently a local, with his hands in his pockets and a beret on his head. The man just stood there, shouting out in the direction of the Palace Hotel. Dolaboy took a moment to pause and listen so he could make out what the man was saying. "Hello, Meyer." "Hello, Meyer," the man shouted, again and again. "We jets in Berlin." It took a moment for the significance of what the man was doing to register with Dolaboy. The phrase translated into English as "Hello, Meyer." "Hello, Meyer. So, how's it going in Berlin?" The beauty of the moment dawned on him. In the early days of the war, Hermann Göring was so confident the Third Reich would win the war that he'd famously bragged to the German people, "If the British and the Americans ever bomb Berlin, my name is Meyer." The image of the middle-aged Luxembourger taunting Göring was a perfect end to this chapter in John Dolaboy's life. The man was enjoying himself so much Dolaboy felt no need to tell him that Göring was gone. Besides, Hermann Göring was never coming back. In Washington, on July 6, 1945, in a classified memorandum with the subject heading "Exploitation of German Specialists in Science and Technology in the United States," the Joint Chiefs of Staff finally approved on paper a Nazi scientist program. President Truman was not made aware of the initiative. The governing body that had been assigned to exercise general supervision over the program and to formulate general policies for procurement, utilization, and control of specialists was the Military Intelligence Division of the War Department, G2. A 5-page memo was sent out to 8 agencies within the War Department outlining principles and procedures governing the classified program. The 3 most important points were that certain German specialists could be utilized to increase our war-making capacity against Japan and aid our post-war military research, that no known or alleged war criminals should be brought to the United States, and that the purpose of this plan should be understood to be temporary military exploitation of the minimum number of German specialists necessary. According to this initiative, as soon as the jobs were completed, the specialists would be returned to Europe. Participants, it was noted, should be hereafter referred to as eminent German specialists as opposed to German scientists, because not all the Nazis being requested for program approval had degrees in science. Included in the mix were Nazi bureaucrats, businessmen, accountants, and lawyers. The project also now had an official code name, Operation Overcast. The name Paperclip would not be used for another 8 months. Military agencies that were interested in hiring German specialists were to submit their requests to the Assistant Chief of Staff, G2. Only the most compelling argument should bring a German specialist to this country, the initiative stated, and only the chosen, rare minds whose continuing intellectual productivity we wish to use would be approved. The British would be made aware of the program, in general terms. At some point after the first large group of scientists had arrived in the United States, a suitable press release would be generated by the War Department so as to avoid possible resentment on the part of the American public. A list of desired German scientists list I accompanied the memo. It included 115 rocket specialists. When the British learned about the U.S. Army's intentions to hire the German rocket scientists, they asked to first be allowed to conduct 2 rocket exploitation projects of their own. The Americans agreed and released into British custody a group of scientists, engineers, and technicians including Wernher von Braun, Walter Dornberger, and Arthur Rudolph. The first British project was called Operation Backfire, a V-2 field test that took place on Germany's north coast, at a former Krupp naval gun range in Cuxhaven. Operation Backfire was designed to analyze technical data about the V-2 by having the Nazi rocket engineers fire 4 rockets, also taken piecemeal from Nordhausen, at a target in the North Sea. This would allow the British to evaluate various technical elements, from how the rocket was launched to its flight controls and fuels. Arthur Rudolph, the former Mittelwerk operations director, was considered an expert in launch techniques, and to his biographer, he later recalled a scene from Operation Backfire. The V2 ran on alcohol of the same chemistry as that appearing in, say, Jack Daniels and Old Grandad. The people at the test site apparently knew that. One night, according to Rudolph, a group of British and German V2 technicians got drunk together on the rocket fuel. A British officer came upon the group arm in arm, apparently comrades now, and lustily singing, "We're fahren gegen England," or "We will march against England." General Dornberger was not part of the drinking and singing. The British kept him on a short leash, away from the test firing and always under a watchful eye. The British had alternative plans for Walter Dornberger. They were not interested in the knowledge Dornberger possessed. They wanted to try him for war crimes. After the test, he would not be returned to the Americans as the British had originally promised. "The British pulled a sneaky on us," explained Major Staver, who attended Operation Backfire. The Americans were not permitted to take Dornberger back after the operation. Instead, Dornberger was declared on loan and was taken to England. There, he and von Braun were interrogated for a week by the British and then kept behind barbed wire in Wimbledon for 4.5 weeks while waiting to be picked up by the Americans. Eventually, von Braun was returned, but General Dornberger was not. Instead, he was issued a brown jumpsuit with the letters PW for prisoner of war stenciled on the back. Under armed guard, he was taken to the London District Cage near the Windermere Bridge for interrogation. From there, General Dornberger was transferred first to a castle in Wales and then to Special Camp 11 in Island Farm, South Wales, where he was an extremely unpopular prisoner. Walter Dornberger was definitely the most hated man in the camp, Sergeant Ron Williams, a prison guard, recalled. Even his own people hated him. He never went out to the local farms to work like other prisoners. Wherever General Dornberger went while he was at Special Camp 11, he required an escort. The British feared that other prisoners might kill him. On the morning of September 12, 1945, Wernher von Braun, Dr. Eberhard Rees, and 5 mid-level V-2 rocket engineers left their U.S. Army-sponsored housing, in the town of Witzenhausen, for the last time. The men climbed into 2 Army jeeps, headed for France. The Germans knew they were heading to the United States to work. They were not aware that their driver, First Lieutenant Morris Sipser, spoke German. As First Lieutenant Sipser drove the group to their destination in Paris, he listened to von Braun crack crass anti-American jokes. The jeep crossed over the Saar River into France, and Sipser overheard von Braun say to his colleagues, "Well, take a good look at Germany, fellows. You may not see it for a long time to come." In Washington, Operation Overcast had been approved as a temporary program, but von Braun, ever the visionary, had the foresight to see that many of the rocketeers and engineers were heading to America to stay. "We felt no moral scruples about the possible future use of our brainchild," von Braun later told New Yorker magazine writer Daniel Lang. "We were interested solely in exploring outer space. It was simply a question with us of how the golden cow could be milked most successfully." After arriving in Paris, the Germans were taken to the Officers' Club at Orly Airport for dinner. Accompanying von Braun, Rees, and the 5 other V-2 engineers were 4 scientists from the Hermann Göring Research Institute, handpicked by Colonel Putt and headed for Wright Field. They were Theodor Zobel, Rudolf Edsä, Wolfgang Nagerath, and Gerhard Braun. Luftwaffe test pilot Karl Bauer was also with the group. He had served as aircraft manufacturer Messerschmitt's chief Me-262 test pilot. Accompanying him he had his mechanic, Andreas Sebald. A little before 10 p.m., the Germans boarded a C-54 military transport plane waiting on the tarmac in the pouring rain. Quickly the plane moved through the clouds and a beautiful, clear sky with a moonlight night greeted us, Karl Bauer wrote in his diary. "For the first time I cannot recall the number of years I enjoyed a flight as a passenger." After a stop to refuel on the island of Santa Maria, in the Azores, the aircraft crossed the Atlantic, refueled in Newfoundland, and landed at Newcastle Airport in Wilmington, Delaware, at 2 a.m. on September 20, 1945. Because the Germans were under military custody, they could not be traditionally processed by customs. After a few hours, the 16 Germans boarded a second, smaller airplane and were flown to the Naval Air Station at Squantum, in Quincy, Massachusetts. At the naval base the Germans were loaded into sedans and driven out to the edge of dock, where a troop ship waited for them. They boarded the vessel and made a short trip to a chain of small islands in Boston Harbor, the Harbor Islands, and out to the far end to a gravel shoal off Nix's Mate, where they were obscured from civilian view. There, a small Boston whaler idled on the sea. Its captain was named Corky, and the 21-year-old intelligence officer who would take charge of the Germans was named Henry Kamm. Each German scientist was lowered down into the little Boston whaler by a harness hanging from a rope. They were all seasick as can be, Kamm later recalled. Fort Strong, on an island in the middle of Boston Harbor, had been used as a training camp during the Civil War and remained in use on and off through World War I. The fortress-like nature of the coastal defense facility made it an ideal place for a secret military program like Operation Overcast. When the first German scientists arrived in September 1945, the fortress was still under Army control but had not been used for nearly 30 years. Thick weeds grew in between the gun blocks and pedestal mounts. The administration and observation buildings had fallen into disrepair. But the Army barracks was easily converted into what would become known as the Operation Overcast Hotel. German prisoners of war were moved onto the island to work as staff, including as translators, cooks, bakers, and tailors. Kamm's job was to process the scientists, which included fingerprinting, medical examinations, and coordination with the FBI. This all took time, and the Germans were not known for patience. Before long an insidious unease settled in among the scientists, Kamm recalled. When the weather was clear the Germans played volleyball games outside. Far off in the distance they could make out the Boston skyline and see the tall, shiny buildings on shore. But often the fog rolled in, and the island was soaked in a thick, dense mist for days at a time. To pass the time the scientists stayed indoors and played Monopoly, which they called the capitalist's game. Still, it was impossible to deny that Fort Strong took on a penal colony feel, as Kamm recalled. Soon the Germans started calling their new home Devil's Island. Finally, on September 29, 1945, Major James P. Hamel, an intelligence officer with the Army Ordnance Corps, was sent to the east coast of the island to escort a group of Germans off. Hamel had been in Nordhausen with Major Staver at war's end and had personally assisted in the mission to locate enough rocket parts to reconfigure 100 of them at the White Sands Proving Ground. His presence on Devil's Island had to have been a welcome one among the rocket scientists. Hamel took 6 of them: Eberhard Rees, Erich Neubert, Theodor Poppel, August Schultz, Wilhelm Jungert, and Walter Schwadetsky to Aberdeen Proving Ground, where they began translating, cataloging, and evaluating the information from the Dornton mine stash. Hamel's next mission was to escort Wernher von Braun by train to Fort Bliss, Texas. The train ride began on October 6, 1945, and was a memorable event. Operation Overcast was a highly classified military matter, and Major Hamel was required to keep watch over von Braun 24 hours a day. Drawing any kind of attention to the German scientist was to be avoided at all cost. In St. Louis, Major Hamel and von Braun were assigned to a Pullman car filled with wounded war veterans from the 82nd Division, renowned for parachute assaults into Sicily and Salerno. Also in the train car were wounded war veterans from the 101st Airborne Division, men lauded for action in the Normandy invasion and the Battle of the Bulge. Hamel quickly arranged for himself and von Braun to be moved into a different car. The train moved along to the Texas border. Hamel watched as the man sitting next to von Braun began engaging him in friendly conversation, asking von Braun where he was from and what business he was in. Von Braun, apparently well versed in lying on demand, replied that he was from Switzerland and that he was in the steel business. Well, it turned out that this particular gentleman knew Switzerland like the back of his hand, Major Hamel later recalled, and was himself in the steel business. Von Braun quickly qualified steel business to mean ball bearings. As it so happened, the man was also an expert on ball bearings, Hamel explained. The train whistle blew. The approaching station stop was Texarkana, which was the businessman's destination. As the man prepared to exit the train, he turned back to Von Braun and waved goodbye to him. "If it wasn't for the help that you Swiss gave us, there is no telling as to who might have won the war," the businessman said. Army ordnance finally had their scientists on U.S. soil, and work commenced at Fort Bliss without delay. In Germany, the drama between the U.S. Chemical Warfare Service and Fiat over the suspected war criminal Otto Ambros escalated. Despite orders from Schaeff to arrest him, Ambros remained a fugitive in plain sight. He lived and worked with impunity in the French zone. At Dustbin, Fiat officers continued to learn more about who Ambros was and the wartime role that he had played in chemical weapons research and development. In an interrogation with Albert Speer, Fiat learned that no single person had been as critical to the development of Hitler's vast arsenal of nerve agents and poison gases as Otto Ambros had been. He is known to have spoken to Hitler at a high-level German conference on chemical warfare, a Fiat report read. Another stated, Ambros' importance, from the intelligence point of view, has been re-emphasized by the recent chemical warfare investigation at Dustbin. Speer and the German chemical warfare experts agree that he is the key man in German chemical warfare production. Major Tilly was outraged by it all, but there was little he could do except put Ambros under surveillance. Initial attempts to capture Dr. Ambros maintained the fiction of civility. At the end of August or beginning of September 1945, an attempt was made to induce Ambros to return to the American zone, Tilly wrote in a Fiat report. In response, Ambros claimed to be unable to return then as the French authorities would not permit him to leave the French zone. Major Tilly knew this was a lie. Ambros regularly traveled back and forth between Ludwigshafen, in the French zone, and the IG Farben guest house, Villa Kohlhoff, outside Heidelberg, in the American zone. This made Tilly furious. "This man is thought to be far too dangerous and undesirable to be left at liberty, let alone be employed by the Allied authorities," Tilly wrote. Fiat authorized him to set up a sting operation in an attempt to capture and arrest Ambros. Captain Edelsten was assigned the job of tracking Ambros day and night. Through the Counterintelligence Corps in Heidelberg, Captain Edelsten, working with a Colonel Mumford, set up a network of undercover agents who began to follow Ambros's every move. "Saw Ambros at LU, read one report. Drives his own car, usually alone. Slept in car for 2 hours one night, on roadside," another set of field notes revealed. Ambros traveled frequently, to Freiburg, Rheinfelden, and Baden-Baden. He'd even been back to Gendorf, a brazen move, considering the 7th Army had an outstanding arrest warrant for him there. But Ambros was quicker than the U.S. Army and had a better intelligence network in place as well. Whenever the U.S. Army showed up to arrest him, he was already gone. Finally, Captain Edelsten reached Ambros on the telephone. Edelsten told Ambros that Col. Mumford was anxious to see him again, and asked if a meeting could be arranged for the following Sunday, at the Farben Villa. Ambros agreed. Fiat planned its takedown. Plainclothes CIC officers would wait outside Villa Kohlhoff, out of eyesight, until after Captain Edelsten placed Ambros under arrest. Then they'd step in and transport the wanted war criminal back to Dustbin. Except Ambros was one step ahead. With his well-established private intelligence center complete with secretaries and errand boys, he learned the meeting was a ruse to arrest him. When Edelsten arrived at the villa, Ambros's secretary invited him inside. Smiling broadly, she apologized and said Dr. Ambros is not able to come. Edelsten feigned understanding and sat down at a large banquet table elegantly set for 8. The secretary whispered in his ear, "You have been at Gendorf," as if to taunt him. Ambros, it turned out, had his own people following the Fiat agents who had been tailing him, a posse of various deputies Ludwigshafen and Gendorf. Embarrassed and infuriated by the audacity of it all, Edelsten finished his tea and got up to leave. Just as Edelsten was leaving, Ambrose's car pulled in, and for a fleeting moment Edelsten believed he would capture him after all. Instead, a look-alike emerged from car and said was unable to come. Ambrose had sent a double, Edelsten had been burned. Fiat was being made fun of, and there was little they could do. Captain Edelsten left the IG Farben villa red-faced and empty-handed. Gave CIC description of Ambrose's car, he noted in his report. Light blue closed saloon. Edelsten posted his men to watch the bridges around Heidelberg and promised to arrest Ambrose if he ever arrived. But of course he never did. Adding insult to injury, the following day Dr. Otto Ambrose sent Captain Edelsten a formal note, neatly typed on fancy stationery, with Farben's wartime address still embossed on the letterhead. "Sorry that I could not make the appointment," Ambrose wrote. He signed his name in thick black ink. At Dustbin, Major Tilly continued to interrogate Ambrose's colleagues. In late August 1945, Tilly got a very lucky lead from Ambrose's former deputy, the Farben chemist Jürgen von Klink. Von Klink was back at Dustbin now, and under intense scrutiny after having been in attendance alongside Ambrose at the meeting with Tar and the representative from Dow Chemical, Wilhelm Hirschkind. Jürgen von Klink had amassed a sizable Dustbin dossier of his own. A Nazi ideologue, von Klink had been a loyal party member since 1933 and an officer with the SS since 1936. One interrogator described him as wily, untrustworthy, and not employable. Von Klink was also an elitist and had made more than a few enemies because of this. Speaking in confidence with Major Tilly, fellow chemist and Dustbin internee Wilhelm Horn candidly expressed his thought about Jürgen von Klink. Von Klink had a magnetic presence, a brilliant mind, handsome, polished and a wonderful talker, but lacked the essential characteristics that would make him a truly great man, said Horn. This was because von Klink was an egoist, very proud of the nobility implied in his name, and an opportunist who knew how to make the best of his chances. Horn confirmed that von Klink was a long-standing and avowed Nazi, but that it had always grated von Klink's pride that such common people as Hitler and his minions were in the highest places, said Horn. Tilly asked Horn how high up von Klink was in the production of war gases. Horn revealed that von Klink had been deputy chief of the ultra-secret Committee C for chemical weapons. In other words, Jürgen von Klink was Otto Ambrose's right-hand man. Armed with this information, Major Tilly presented von Klink with a piece of paper to sign. It was a declaration, stating that he knew none of which had been concealed by others. Von Klink refused to sign. Tilly explained that withholding information was a crime. Threatened with arrest, von Klink admitted that there were a few things he hadn't been entirely truthful about. He told Major Tilly that in the late fall of 1944, Ambrose had instructed him to destroy all paperwork regarding war gases, particularly the contracts between Farben and the Wehrmacht. Instead, von Klink had carefully selected a cache of important documents and secreted them away in a large steel drum. He had hired someone to bury the steel drum on a remote farm outside Gendorf. Where, exactly, von Klink said he wasn't sure. He told Tilly that he had deliberately refused to learn where they were buried in order to be able to deny that he knew of any documents concealed anywhere. He gave Major Tilly a list of possible hiding places. For 2 months Major Tilly searched the countryside around Gendorf for the steel drum, interviewing locals and patiently waiting for a solid lead. Finally, on October 27, 1945, he found what he'd been looking for. During an interrogation with Gendorf's fire chief, a man called Brandmeister Keller, the location was revealed. There was more. Brandmeister Keller had also hidden documents for Otto Ambrose. At first, Keller denied that he had secreted any documents, read the Fiat report. When he was told that his arrest order was in Major Tilly's pocket, he remembered 4 boxes Ambrose had asked him to fetch in 1945. Ambrose gave him various barrels and boxes to hide with various farmers in Gendorf. But the most important barrel, the large steel drum from von Klink, had been buried at the lonely farm of Lorenz Moser, near Berghausen. Von Klink's hidden barrel produced hard evidence, including a letter from Ambrose stating that he had been in charge of document destruction and why. All papers which prove our cooperation with Tabun and Sarin in the low works, the DL plant in the upper work, must of course be destroyed or placed in security, read one letter inside the drum, signed by Otto Ambrose. It was attached to a stack of nerve agent contracts between Farben and Speer's ministry, papers that von Klink had been ordered to destroy. These contracts chronicled full details of Tabun production and other details of Die Herrenfurth, including a detailed plan of all buildings and much or most of the apparatus, photographs and drawings, and many other valuable data, covering the period from 1938 or earlier until March 1945. Now Major Tilly had two key pieces of evidence he had not had before. There was more damning information pertaining specifically to Otto Ambrose that had been hidden in the steel drum. One document, written by Albert Speer, described two meetings with himself, Ambrose, and Hitler in June 1944, which not only confirmed the high position that Ambrose held but that he was a war profiteer. I reported to the Führer that Dr. Ambrose of IG. Farben had developed a new process by which Buna of the same quality as natural rubber can be produced. Sometime in the future no further imports of natural rubber will be required. The Führer has ordered a donation of 1 million marks to Ambrose, Speer wrote. A final piece of evidence shined a light on Farben's long-term plans for its business venture at Auschwitz. In addition to its Buna factory, IG Farben planned to produce chemical weapons at the death camp. The company had plans for further construction of CW plant at Auschwitz. In February 1945, Tilly wrote in his Fiat report. Tilly returned to Dustbin with the steel drum and the documents. Von Klink appeared shocked when Tilly told him that the steel drum had been located. There are indications that he did not expect them to be found, read Tilly's intelligence report. Fiat now had documentary evidence that Ambrose was guilty of contravening American military government laws by concealing documents connected with German military preparations. There were hundreds of documents, including full data on Die Herrenfurth, production sheets for Tabun and other war gases, as well as many other matters which claimed to have burned in the furnaces at Gendorf in April 1945. It may well be that these papers, added to the formulas, production methods, and the secret CW contracts between IG and the Reich from 1935 to 1945, which were discovered in a Gendorf safe on that same day, may give us a more complete picture of German CW preparations than of most other fields of German armament and general war production. Major Tilly had pulled off a scientific intelligence coup d'état. Tilly took the information to a colleague, a veteran intelligence officer, who reminded him that there was an alternative theory to be considered regarding von Klink. Basing oneself on experience with enemy agents who confess plots freely, one may come to the conclusion that a lesser secret has been admitted to deflect the investigation from a more important secret, the officer explained. Efforts to capture Ambrose were redoubled. 2 days after the steel drum find, on October 29, 1945, the British Intelligence Objectives Subcommittee issued a warrant for the arrest of Dr. Ambrose. Now there were 2 out of 3 Allied nations lobbying for the immediate arrest of Hitler's favorite chemist. Otto Ambrose was dangerous and undesirable and should not be left at liberty, read the arrest report. Fiat knew Ambrose could remain protected as long as he stayed in the French zone. He is wily and he will remain there as he knows the hunt for him is on in the US zone, the report explained. There was little to do but wait. But patience again paid off. It took 3 months for Otto Ambrose's hubris to get the better of him. On January 17, 1946, Ambrose traveled outside the French zone and was arrested. He was sent to Dustbin, where Major Tilly was waiting to interrogate him. After Fiat squeezed him for information, Ambrose was turned over to Colonel Burton Andrus, now commandant of the Nuremberg jail. Sometime in the foreseeable future Ambros would face judgment at Nuremberg. Any suggestion that Otto Ambros would one day have a prominent and prosperous place in civilized society, and that the American government would be just one of the governments to employ him, would have seemed pure fantasy. Then again, the Cold War was coming. Part 3. The Past is a Foreign Country. L.P. Hartley. Chapter 11. The Ticking Clock. In the late summer of 1945, the Nazi scientist program underwent a significant organizational change. At the behest of the State War Navy Coordinating Committee, control over the program was removed from the Military Intelligence Division of the War Department, G2, and given over to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The newly created Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency would now be in charge of decision-making for the rapidly expanding classified program. The JIOA was a subcommittee of the Joint Intelligence Committee, which provided national security information to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. To understand the JIOA's power, and how it ran the Nazi scientist program so secretively, is to first understand the nature of the Joint Intelligence Committee. According to national security historian Larry A. Valero, who has written a monograph on the subject for the CIA, the JIC was and remains one of the most enigmatic of all the American intelligence agencies. The JIC structure was always in motion, always morphing and changing, a flexible, ad hoc system, Valero says. Subcommittees came and went, so did staff officers, but JIC decisions always had to be by consensus and were always reported to the Joint Chiefs. Little has been written about the inner workings of the JIOA, but the stories of individual Nazi scientists, and the JIOA's trail of partially declassified papers, helped to define this powerful post-war organization. In the immediate aftermath of the German surrender, the Joint Intelligence Committee was focused on the emerging Soviet threat. Between June 15, 1945, and August 9, 1945, the JIC wrote and delivered 16 major intelligence reports and 27 policy papers to the Joint Chiefs. The most important JIC estimates involved the military capabilities and future intentions of the USSR, says Valero. Those intelligence estimates determined that the Soviets were ideologically hostile to the West and would continue to seek global domination, an attitude they had managed to skillfully conceal during the war. In September 1945, the JIC advised the Joint Chiefs that the Soviet Union would postpone open conflict with the West in the immediate future, but only so it could rebuild its military arsenal and by 1952 be back at fighting strength. After this date, said the JIC, the Soviets would be ready and able to engage the United States in total war. The following month, JIC Intelligence Report 250/4 warned the Joint Chiefs that 8 out of 10 leading German scientists in the field of guided missiles had recently gone missing from Germany, had most likely been captured by the Soviets, and were now at work in the USSR. Similarly threatening, noted the report, 2 German physics institutes had been seized by the Red Army and reassembled in the USSR, not just the laboratories and the libraries but the scientists as well. JIC 250/4 warned of intensive Soviet scientific research programs underway across Russia, all of which threatened the West. It was from within this environment of intense suspicion that the JIOA was created. The Nazi scientist program was an aggressive U.S. military program from the moment the JIOA took control, just a few weeks after 2 atomic bombs ended the war with Japan. The employment of German scientists was specifically and strategically aimed at achieving military supremacy over the Soviet Union before the Soviet Union was able to dominate the United States. Attaining supreme military power meant marshalling all the cutting-edge science and technology that could be culled from the ruins of the Reich. In the eyes of military intelligence, the fact that the scientists happened to be Nazis was incidental, a troublesome detail. It had no bearing on the bigger plan. The clock was ticking and, according to the Joint Intelligence Committee, would likely run out sometime around 1952. There was language in the existing Nazi scientist policy that now had to be dealt with by the JIOA. The phrase "no known or alleged war criminal" could not remain as part of policy nomenclature for long, nor could the phrase "no ardent Nazis." These words had been put there to appease a few generals in the Pentagon, certain individuals in the State Department and moralists like Dr. H.P. Robertson, General Eisenhower's chief of scientific intelligence. For the program to move forward according to this new strategy, the language needed to change. With the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency now in control, a new, aggressive recruitment process would begin. On its governing body, the JIOA had one representative of each member agency of the Joint Intelligence Committee, the Army's Director of Intelligence, the Chief of Naval Intelligence, the Assistant Chief of Air Staff II, and a representative from the State Department. The diplomat in the group was outnumbered by the military officers 3-1. The State Department officer assigned to the JIOA was Samuel Klaus, and he was perceived by his JIOA colleagues to be a troublemaker from day one. Samuel Klaus was a 42-year-old shining star in the State Department, a brilliant lawyer, avid horseman, and Hebrew scholar who also spoke Russian and German. Because Klaus was the man on the JIOA who was in charge of approving the visas for all incoming German scientists, it was important that he be on board with what the JIOA wanted to accomplish. But Samuel Klaus was fundamentally opposed to the Nazi scientist program, and this created intense conflict within the JIOA. Klaus had hands-on experience with Nazi Party ideology, owing to his wartime work for the U.S. Foreign Economic Administration during the war. During the war, Klaus ran Operation Safe Haven, a program with international reach designed to capture Nazi assets, including stolen art and gold being smuggled out of Germany for safekeeping in neutral countries. During his years running Safe Haven, Klaus had interviewed hundreds of German civilians, and he had developed the belief that many ordinary Germans had profited from the Nazi Party and had had a tacit understanding of what was happening to the Jews. In his role as the State Department representative on the JIOA, Klaus argued that the Germans at issue were not brilliant scientists who had been unwittingly caught in a maelstrom of evil, but rather that they were amoral opportunists of mediocre talent. JIOA records indicate that Klaus's sentiments were shared by at least two of his State Department colleagues, including Herbert Cummings and Howard Travers. But it was Samuel Klaus who was unabashedly vocal about how he felt and what he believed. At a JIOA meeting in the late fall of 1945, Klaus vowed that less than a dozen would ever be permitted to enter the U.S. on his watch. For this, he was seen as a thorn in the side of military intelligence, and he was also outnumbered. Per the JIOA's charter, it was required to share its plan with a cabinet-level advisory board, which included a representative from the Department of Commerce. As it so happened, the representative from the Commerce Department, John C. Green, was an advocate of the German scientist program, apparently without benefit of knowing who these German scientists really were. In the fall of 1945, Green came up with an idea that would undermine Samuel Klaus's resistance to Operation Overcast. After the war in Europe ended, President Truman put the Department of Commerce in charge of a program designed to excite the nation about a unique form of reparations being culled from the defeated German state, namely, the acquisition of scientific and technical information. There would be no financial compensation coming from Nazi Germany, the Department of Commerce explained, but American industry could now benefit from a different kind of restitution, knowledge. Secretary of Commerce Henry Wallace had been appointed by the President to supervise the release of thousands of what would become known as PB reports, named after the Commerce Department's Office of the Publication Board. These reports contained non-armaments-related information collected by CIO's officers in Germany after the war. The idea behind the PB reports was to get average Americans to start their own small businesses inspired by German technological advances. These new businesses would be a boon to America's post-war prosperity, the Commerce Department said. Thanks to Reich scientists, the public was told, beverage manufacturers could now sterilize fruit juice without heat. Women could enjoy run-proof hosiery. Butter could be churned at the rate of 1,500 pounds per hour. These lists seemed not to end. Yeast could be produced in unlimited quantities, and wool could be pulled from sheepskins without injuring the animal's hide, all because of brilliant German scientists. Hitler's wizards had reduced suitcase-sized electrical components to the size of a pinky finger and pioneered electromagnetic tape. Henry Wallace was one of the nation's greatest champions of the idea that Americans could find prosperity thanks to science. Wallace had served under Roosevelt in 1944, when Roosevelt promised Americans 60 million jobs. The promise became the subject of a book by Wallace, 60 Million Jobs. As Secretary of Commerce, he intended to make good on it. Business, industry, and government could work together to make the world prosperous in peace, Wallace said. German science was a jumping-off point. The public was not made aware of a second list regarding captured German scientific and technical information, one marked classified. This list catalogued 1,800 reports on German technology with military potential. Subject headings included, rockets, chemical warfare, medical practice, aeronautics, ordnance, insecticides, and physics, nuclear. The man in charge of both lists, the classified and the unclassified one, was Henry Wallace's executive secretary and his representative on the JIOA, John C. Green. Regarding the classified list, Green got an idea. Peace and prosperity were, in principle, sound ideas. But there was big business in war. Green wanted to make the classified list available to certain groups in industry. Specialized knowledge locked up in the minds of German scientists and technicians, Green said. It needed to be shared. To help foster this sharing, in the fall of 1945 John C. Green traveled to Wright Field, in Dayton, Ohio, to meet with Colonel Donald Putt. The first group of 6 Germans brought to Wright Field in the fall of 1945 lived in an isolated and secure housing area called the Hilltop, a cluster of 5 single-story wooden buildings and 3 small cottages that had once housed the National Youth Administration. Almost no one but the program's administrators knew that the German scientists were there. There was a single-lane dirt road that passed by the Hilltop, used only by locals who needed to visit the town dump. Trucks and station wagons filled with trash sped by the Hilltop's secret inhabitants, and when it rained the road turned into a sea of mud. This annoyed the Germans, and they began compiling a list of grievances to share with Colonel Putt at a later date. They knew better than to complain just yet. Considering the fate and circumstances of many of their colleagues back in Germany, theirs was a particularly good deal. But when the timing was right, they would share this list of indignities, which would in turn affect the Nazi scientist program in the most unusual way. The original scientists at Wright Field were listed as Dr. Gerhard Braun, Motor Research, Dr. Theodor Zobel, Aerodynamics, and Dr. Rudolf Edseh, Rocket Fuels. The specialists were Mr. Otto Bach, Supersonics, Mr. Hans Richter, Aerodynamics, and Mr. Albert Patton, a businessman. Their salaries averaged $12,480 a year, plus a $6 per diem, the equivalent of about $175,000 in 2013. Because of an oversight, later caught and corrected, the Germans did not pay U.S. taxes for the first 2 years and 20 months of the program. At the Hilltop, a husband and wife team of housekeepers looked after the Germans' domestic needs, washed their laundry, and made their beds. German prisoners of war who had already been brought to the United States and were not yet repatriated acted as cooks. The 6 scientists and specialists and the others who would soon follow carried military-issue identification cards that had a large green S stamped on the front, indicating that they were not allowed to leave the base on their own. A gate running around the perimeter of the Hilltop was to be locked from 5 p.m. to 7 a.m. each night. On weekends, U.S. Army intelligence officers escorted the Germans into Dayton, where they could exercise at the local YMCA. A priest was brought in from Cincinnati to deliver Sunday Mass in German. We would like you to know and to appreciate that you are here in the interest of science, and we hope that you will work with us in close harmony to further develop and expand your various subjects of interest. Read the introductory pamphlet issued to each specialist at Wright Field. We have tried to make you comfortable in the quarters assigned to you. What the Germans craved most was respect, and this eluded them. During the war, Hitler's scientists and industrialists had been treated with great admiration by the Reich. Most scientists enjoyed financial reward. But here at Wright Field, many of the Germans' American counterparts looked down on them with disdain. The mere mention of a German scientist is enough to precipitate emotions in Air Corps personnel ranging from vehemence to frustration, one manager stated in an official classified report. As commanding general for intelligence at Wright Field, Colonel Donald Pudd was in charge of the German specialist program. Pudd had great admiration for each of the scientists, having handpicked almost every one of them in Germany, at the Hermann Göring Aeronautical Research Center at Folken Road, and elsewhere. He could not fathom why the specialists were looked upon with contempt. All they wanted was an opportunity to work, Pudd said. Colonel Pudd's vision for the Germans' workload in America was threefold. Initially, he planned for the men to write reports on their past and future work. Next, those reports would be translated and circulated among American engineers at Wright Field. Then Air Technical Service Command would hold research and development seminars at Wright Field, with invitations sent out to defense contractors, university laboratories, and any other interested parties with top-secret clearance and a contract with the Army Air Forces. But Pudd's idea came to a grinding halt after the War Department weighed in on his proposal, responding to what it called calculated risk. The German scientist program was a highly classified military program and needed to remain secret. A War Department memo required that the Germans remain properly segregated from persons not directly concerned with their exploitation. There was to be no fraternizing with American scientists. Collaboration with defense contractors and others was impossible at this point in the program. The German specialists were offended by the way they were treated. Word from Dr. Herbert Wagner, inventor of the HS-293 missile, was that Gould Castle on Long Island, where Wagner resided and worked, had marble bathtubs. Naval intelligence allowed their German scientists to take field trips into Manhattan. The Germans at Wright Field told Pudd they felt like caged animals, and they demanded that something be done about it. Pudd saw opportunity here. He wrote to Army Intelligence, G2, to say that the Germans' overall malaise was critically affecting their ability to work. When the Pentagon ignored Pudd's concerns, he appealed to Major Hugh Nair, his commanding general at Air Technical Service Command. Nair wrote to the Pentagon. Intangibles of a scientist's daily life directly affect the quality of his product, he said, but this too had little effect. In Washington, the general feeling was that Operation Overcast was temporary and that the Germans should be happy to have jobs. Besides, the Nuremberg trials were about to begin. On October 18, 1945, an indictment was lodged by the International Military Tribunal against the defendants named as major war criminals. The trial would take place inside the East Wing of the Nuremberg Palace of Justice, with opening statements beginning November 20. Because this was a military tribunal, sentences would be passed by judges, not jurors. Nuremberg as a city had played a unique role in the rise of the Nazi Party. It had been the site of Hitler's Nazi Party rallies, colossal military parades supported by as many as 400,000 Nazi loyalists, and home to the Nuremberg race laws. Now the leaders in the regime would be tried in this location for conspiracy, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. As the trial began, 21 defendants sat crammed onto two benches, inside courtroom 600, headphones over their ears. Behind them on the wall, symbolically positioned over their heads, was a large marble statue of the hideous monster Medusa. The 21 present faced the death penalty if convicted. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, and so devastating, Chief U.S. Prosecutor Justice Robert H. Jackson famously declared, that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored, because it cannot survive their being repeated. The trial would last almost a year. With stories about Nuremberg and the Nazi war crimes dominating world news, complaints about comfort from the Germans at Wright Field meant very little to the War Department General Staff. The same month the Nuremberg trial opened, in October 1945, the Army Air Forces hosted a grand two-day-long fair at Wright Field. On display were captured German and Japanese aircraft and rockets seen by the public for the first time since war's end. Over 500,000 people from 26 countries came to marvel at the confiscated enemy equipment, said to be worth $150 million. Among the items on display were the V-2 rocket, the Focke-Wulf FW-190 G-3 fighter aircraft, and the Messerschmitt Me-262. Particularly fascinating to the public was that some of the airplanes still had swastikas painted on their tails. The fair was so popular that the Army Air Forces extended it for 5 days. There was no mention made of the fact that several of the men who had designed and engineered these weapons were living a stone's throw away, at the hilltop. Among the 500,000 visitors at the fair was John C. Green, the Commerce Department's representative on the JIOA Advisory Board and its executive secretary overseeing the PB reports. The board had just changed its name to the Office of Technical Services, underscoring its transformation from a passive board to a more active service that would make use of cutting-edge science and technology. As planned, Green tracked down Colonel Putt at the Wright Field Fair. He had a myriad of questions for Putt, all of which centered around one idea: how could all this science and technology on display benefit American industry moving forward? Initially, Putt was uneasy about Green's attention, but in the end he decided to take a gamble on him. After all, John C. Green had access to the classified list. Putt shared with him some information about the German scientists on the hilltop. How they were like men kept in an ivory tower, how their talents were squandered by policy and prejudice in some circles in Washington, D.C. They needed employment opportunities, Putt lamented. Perhaps Green could help? Green seemed amenable, and Putt took note. During his visit to the Air Force's fair, Wright Field evidenced keen interest and inquired as to the reaction of industry toward the possible employment of German scientists, Putt wrote in a memo. He was not yet clear if Green's influence is favorable or unfavorable. But Putt decided to take the risk. He forwarded to Green several letters of interest from defense contractors regarding potential employment of the German scientists. These documents had already been received by Air Materiel Command. They included letters from Dow Chemical Company, the Air Search Manufacturing Company, and the Aircraft Industries Association. Defense contracts meant that there was business in the wings waiting to be transacted. It was Washington, D.C., that stood in the way. Putt explained to Green that these private businesses did not have a high enough security clearance to deal directly with the German scientists themselves. John C. Green wrote to JIOA explaining what he had in mind: German scientists of international repute should be allowed, with their families, to enter the United States for long-term work, argued Green. This was good for American businesses. The letters from the defense contractors indicated that there was a great demand for this kind of work. The Commerce Department would set up a board to weed out the Nazis and bring the good Germans in. The German scientists' knowledge and know-how would be fully and freely available to all Americans, said Green. This boom to industry would help create tens of thousands of American jobs. Inside the JIOA, reactions were mixed, particularly among advisory board members. The Assistant Secretary of the Interior was skeptical as to how Commerce could guarantee to keep old Nazis out of the program. The War Department did not like the idea of having to bring the families to America. Army intelligence felt Green's proposal had validity from an economic perspective. If Commerce got involved in the German scientist program, the Army would not necessarily have to shoulder so much of the financial burden. The State Department continued to voice objections, saying that regardless of who footed the bill, visas were not going to be granted to former enemies of the state without thorough and individual investigations. The Nazi scientist program was a temporary military program, State said. Nothing more. John C. Green had an alternative plan. Instead of arguing his case further to the JIOA Advisory Board, he appealed to his boss, Henry Wallace. In turn, Henry Wallace wrote directly to President Truman, requesting that the president support the German science program. Science would help create those 60 million jobs, Wallace said, and nothing had a higher national priority in peacetime than American jobs. It was wise and logical to bring to America scientists of outstanding attainments who can make a positive contribution to our scientific and industrial efforts, Wallace wrote to President Truman on December 4, 1945. The knowledge these men possessed, Wallace said, if added to our own would advance the frontiers of scientific knowledge for national benefit. To illustrate his point, Wallace used one of the most benign scientists in all of Germany, a concrete and road construction expert named Dr. O. Graf, who had helped design the Autobahn. If you agree that the importance of a selected few would be an asset to our economy, I suggest you declare that this to be U.S. policy, Wallace urged the president. For Colonel Donald Putt at Wright Field and the military intelligence members of the JIOA, Henry Wallace's endorsement of the program was like a shot in the arm. Before Wallace's letter to the president, Samuel Klaus of the State Department had suggested that the public would be outraged by the program once they found out about it. It could not stay secret forever, nor was it meant to. Klaus had said that bringing Hitler's former scientists to America for weapons research and development gave the impression that the Army and the Navy were willing to make deals with the devil for national security gains. Henry Wallace's economically minded endorsement changed all that. It gave the German scientists' program an air of democracy, offering counterbalance to what could be perceived as an aggressive military program. Henry Wallace had been staunchly anti-Nazi during the war. Preceding Truman in the vice presidency, Wallace had publicly called Hitler a supreme devil operating through a human form. In another famous speech, he had likened Hitler to Satan 7 times. That Henry Wallace was encouraging President Truman to endorse the German scientist program in the name of economic prosperity gave Operation Overcast a future. Henry Wallace was exactly what the JIOA had been waiting for. On November 4, 1945, a headline in the Washington Post caught the nation's attention: Army uncovers lurid Nazi science of freezing men. The article, written by reporter George Connery, was a major news scoop. In an effort to garner support for subsequent military trials in Nuremberg, the War Department had leaked to Connery the secret CIO's report written by war crimes investigator Dr. Leo Alexander. The report chronicled the freezing experiments conducted at Dachau inside experimental cell Block 5. That human beings had been tortured to death by German physicians in the name of medical science was both horrifying and incomprehensible to most Americans. The Post article revealed that the only man believed to have survived the freezing experiments had been located by Dr. Leo Alexander. Most of the other victims, the so-called Untermenschen whom the Nazi doctors had experimented on, died in the process or were killed. It was likely that the sole surviving victim, a Catholic priest, would provide witness testimony in the Nuremberg courts. Americans were rapt. Kept secret from the public was an astonishing hypocrisy. Less than 150 miles from the Nuremberg courtroom, several of the physicians who had participated in, and many others who were accessory to, these criminal medical experiments were now being employed by the U.S. Army at the Army Air Force's Aeromedical Center, the classified research facility in Heidelberg. This laboratory, dreamed up by Colonel Harry Armstrong and Major General Malcolm Gros at a meeting in France in the spring of 1945, would remain one of the best-kept secrets of Operation Paperclip for decades to come. Here, starting on September 20, 1945, 58 doctors handpicked by Dr. Strughold had been working on medical research projects begun for the Third Reich. Some of the data the Nazi doctors were using in their new army research had been obtained in experiments in which test subjects had been murdered. For Gros and Armstrong, the plan was to have these Luftwaffe doctors reconfigure the results of their war work in Heidelberg under Army supervision. The follow-on plan was for these doctors to come to the United States under paperclip contracts. Because conducting military research inside Germany was a violation of Allied Control Council Law 25 of the Potsdam Accord, the Aeromedical Center's classified nature shielded the Nazi doctors from chance exposure. The co-directors of the secret research facility, Colonel Harry Armstrong and Dr. Hubertus Strughold, were alike in many ways, so much so that some saw the two men as mirror images of one another. The growing success of the Aero Medical Center would prove to be a launching point for each man's meteoric post-war career. Armstrong would eventually be promoted to U.S. Surgeon General of the Air Force. Strughold would become the father of U.S. space medicine. Harry Armstrong, born in 1899, entered into the U.S. military when horses were still being ridden into battle. During World War I, Armstrong learned how to drive a six-mule ambulance and decided to become a doctor. After receiving his medical degree from the University of Louisville, he opened a private practice in Minneapolis. He might have become a country doctor, but he was preoccupied by airplanes and dirigibles. Appointed first lieutenant in the Medical Corps Reserve, Armstrong entered the School of Aviation Medicine at Brooks Field, in San Antonio, Texas, in 1924. In 1925 he decided to specialize in a field of medicine few had ever heard of, and soon he would become a flight surgeon. He had never flown in an airplane before. It was a master sergeant named Irwin H. Nichols who inspired Armstrong to make his first parachute jump. In a lecture that took place in a parachute hangar, Nichols presented the idea that one day entire troops of infantrymen just might jump out of airplanes into combat situations as a group. After the class was over, Armstrong got in a long conversation with Nichols. He told me that he was puzzled by the fact that people who he supervised in practice jumps almost invariably failed to follow his instruction, which was to count 10 after leaving the airplane before pulling the ripcord, Armstrong explained. He said that Nichols feared jumpers would black out or get into a panic and pull the ripcord too quickly. When Nichols hinted that he would be very happy if some doctor would make a jump to see if they could solve his problem, Armstrong's mind was made up. I decided I would make a practice jump and delay my opening as long as possible. A few weeks later, Armstrong was standing in the cockpit of a biplane, wearing a flying suit and a gabardine helmet and getting ready to jump. I had a feeling of panic, Armstrong explained, but he hurled himself out of the aircraft anyway. As he fell through the air, he kept his eyes closed and paid attention to what his body felt like as he descended. The feeling of panic disappeared, he later recalled. He did not lose consciousness or black out. Armstrong allowed himself to free fall for approximately 1,200 feet before he finally pulled the ripcord. His parachute opened and he floated the last 1,000 feet to Earth, where he landed in a grassy Texas field. Harry Armstrong had set a U.S. Army record. He was the first flight surgeon to make a free fall from an aircraft. Armstrong finished school and returned to Minnesota, but with an insatiable love of flying. On March 21, 1930, he closed his practice in Minneapolis and joined the Army for good. His life as one of the most important figures in the history of American aviation and aerospace medicine had begun. When Armstrong arrived with his family at Wright Field, in 1934, the world was enamored with airplanes, which were not yet associated with war but with peacetime progress and the spirit of adventure. Jimmy Doolittle set a transcontinental record flying from California to New Jersey in 11 hours, 16 minutes. Wiley Post and Harold Gatty circled the globe in 8 days. At Wright Field, the primary task of the flight surgeon was determining who was physically fit to fly in the airplanes of the day. Armstrong was a man with a vision, and he was also a soldier. He envisioned a future where wars would be fought in the air. The Army Air Corps' most advanced fighter aircraft was a biplane with a speed of around 200 miles per hour and a flight ceiling of 18,000 feet. Armstrong's work centered around resolving problems related to oxygen deprivation and exposure to cold. One day Armstrong spotted a trapdoor in the floor of his office inside Building 16 at Wright Field. He opened the door, saw a staircase, and climbed down. He found himself in a basement filled with old machinery and drafting tables. An unusual-looking chamber, like something out of a novel by Jules Verne, caught his eye. It was shaped like a globe, made of iron, and had windows like submarine portholes. This was the Army's first and only low-pressure chamber, built decades earlier for its World War I flight surgeon school. The school, located in Mineola, Long Island, had closed down after the war and the chamber had wound up here, at Wright Field. Armstrong got an idea. Next door to his office, Army Air Forces engineers were designing airplanes that could fly faster, higher, and farther than ever before. Armstrong wanted to begin research and development on the medical effects that flying these new airplanes would have on pilots. He wrote a letter to the engineering division at Wright Field requesting permission. The letter was forwarded to Washington. In no time, Armstrong was appointed director of the Physiological Research Unit at Wright Field. His lab took off. Shop mechanics built test chambers from old airplane parts. He hired a scientist from Harvard, a PhD named John Bill Heim. Using volunteer test subjects, Heim and Armstrong gathered data on how the body responds to speed, lower oxygen levels, and decompression sickness and extreme temperatures. But it was an experiment on himself, with a rabbit on his lap, for which Armstrong became legendary. He had been wondering what really happened to the human body above 10,000 feet. Why, and at what specific height, would a man die? Armstrong climbed into the low-pressure chamber with the rabbit on his lap. His technician adjusted the pressure to simulate high altitude. Armstrong's chest began to tighten and his joints hurt. When he rubbed his hands, he felt tiny bubbles along his tendons, ones that he could move around under his skin. He surmised that these were nitrogen bubbles forming in his blood and tissues, and that death at high altitude was caused by blood clotting. Armstrong indicated to the technician that he should simulate an even higher altitude inside the chamber. He was wearing an oxygen mask, but the rabbit on his lap was not. Soon the rabbit would be dead. As the lab technician raised the pressure, the rabbit convulsed and died. When Armstrong got out of the chamber, he dissected the rabbit and found nitrogen bubbles, proving that his hypothesis was correct. Armstrong's discovery gave way to a major milestone in aviation medicine. Working with Heim on more tests, he inserted a viewing tube into the artery of a test animal. The two men took data on what happens to a mammal's body at 40,000, 50,000, and finally 65,000 feet. They were the first to witness that body fluids boil at 63,000 feet. This point would become known as the Armstrong line. This is the altitude beyond which humans cannot survive without a pressure suit. In 1937, Captain Harry Armstrong was considered one of America's aviation medicine pioneers. On October 2 of that year he attended the Aero-Medical Association's first international convention, which took place in the Astor Gallery of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. There, he and Heim reported the results of their recent studies at Wright Field. One of the doctors most interested in these studies was the Luftwaffe physician representing Germany, Dr. Hubertus Strughold. The two men, Armstrong and Strughold, were pioneers in the same field. "We hit it off immediately," remembered Harry Armstrong decades later. That fortuitous meeting would profoundly shape Strughold's post-Nazi career. Some men claim to be shaped by a single event. For Hubertus Strughold, it was watching Halley's Comet streak across the sky from his backyard treehouse in West-Unnen, Germany, in 1910. Forever after, said Strughold, he became preoccupied with what lies above. That same year, a second event shaped the rest of his life. Strughold watched a solar eclipse through a viewing glass and nearly went blind. The lens wasn't as dark as he thought it was and he burned the retina of his right eye, causing permanent damage. When I looked at somebody with the right eye, at his nose, he had no nose. When I looked at somebody at the street, at a distance of about 100 meters at somebody's head, he did not have any head. It was always clear with both eyes, Strughold later explained. Hubertus Strughold had learned the hard way that experiments using one's own body could be dangerous. Still, as a young man, he pursued auto-experimentation with vigor and imagination. In college he studied physics, anatomy, and zoology, but it was physiology that interested him most, the functions of living organisms and their parts. At the University of Würzburg, Strughold taught the world's first college course on the effects high altitude had on the human body. His experimental test data came from himself. On weekends he flew hot air balloons, recording everything from vision to ear pressure to muscle effects. Inside the flying balloon, Professor Strughold recorded how his body responded to rapid acceleration and descent, which in turn made him curious to know how he would feel during radical banking turns. For that he needed an airplane. Strughold found the perfect mentor in a World War I flying ace by the name of Robert Ritter von Greem. Von Greem was a legend. Renowned for his fearlessness in battle, in World War I he had recorded 28 kills. In the 1920s and 1930s he was considered one of the top pilots in Germany and performed a variety of flight-related jobs, including exhibition dogfights against fellow World War I flying ace Ernst Udet. When Adolf Hitler needed a pilot to fly him from Munich to Berlin for the Kapp-Putsch coup attempt in 1920, he chose Robert Ritter von Greem for the job. In 1926, von Greem was hired by Chiang Kai-shek to set up the Chinese Air Force in Canton, China. Returning to Germany, von Greem opened a flight school, located at the top of a mountain in Galgenberg, 2 miles from where Hubertus Strughold taught aviation medicine to college students. Strughold hired von Greem to teach him how to fly, paying him 6 marks per lesson. The two men became fast friends. In Robert Ritter von Greem, Hubertus Strughold found a brilliant match, another man willing to push pilot performance to the edge of unconsciousness. The men would strap themselves into harnesses in von Greem's open cockpit airplane and fly loops and rolls in the skies over Galgenberg. Strughold kept track of their physiological reactions to extreme flight, seeking answers to questions. Can a man draw a straight line while flying upside down? Can a pilot mark a bullseye on a piece of paper immediately after a barrel roll? With how little oxygen could a man legibly write his name? How far up can a man fly before his vision fades? Von Greem was challenged by Strughold's strange requests, and he was willing to fly faster and higher as his new young physician friend recorded data on von Greem's pilot performance and physical capabilities in the air. Strughold knew his tests were original and hoped they would attract interest from the United States. In 1928 his wish came true when he received a prestigious fellowship from the Rockefeller Foundation. Strughold packed his bags, boarded the SS Dresden, and headed to New York. Hubertus Strughold took to America like a fish to water, he later explained. As a Rockefeller Foundation Fellow at the University of Chicago, he was at the center of the music scene in the Roaring Twenties. Listening to jazz music was his favorite pastime after flying. In Chicago he attended vaudeville shows, parties, and dances and became fluent in English. He loved to drink and almost always smoked. His thick German accent distinguished him from everyone else around and made most people remember him. His first scientific paper in English was on oxygen deficiency and how to revive a heart using electric shock. For research he used dogs as test subjects, importing them from Canada at a time when experimenting on dogs from the United States was illegal. Strughold attended conferences in Boston and visited the laboratories at Harvard, at the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota, and at Columbia University in New York. And he met and became friendly with American aviation medicine pioneers like Harry Armstrong. The Rockefeller Fellowship lasted only a year. Back in Germany, Strughold and von Greem took up where they left off. Von Greem was now flying a double-decker Udet Flamingo aircraft, an aerobatic sports biplane made of wood. To determine how many G-forces a man could take before his eyeballs suffered damage, the two men would climb high in the air, then dive down toward the ground until one of them blacked out. Von Greem's longtime friend and colleague Adolf Hitler took power in 1933. In secret, von Greem was called upon by Hermann Göring to rebuild the German Air Force, in violation of the Treaty of Versailles. Through his personal friendship with von Greem, Strughold ingratiated himself into this inner circle of Nazi power. In 1935 he was offered a job that would shape the rest of his life. As director of the Aviation Medical Research Institute of the Reich Air Ministry in Berlin, he was now in the uppermost echelon of Luftwaffe medical research. The lab, located in the suburb of Charlottenburg, featured a state-of-the-art low-pressure chamber and a 10-foot centrifuge in which test subjects could be exposed to varying degrees of gravitational pull. The chamber could take both apes and humans to between 15 and 20 gs. The job required time, commitment, and most of all dedication. The Reich needed the Luftwaffe to help conquer all of Europe. This was why Strughold had packed his bags and moved to Berlin. He would report directly to Erich Hipke, chief of the Luftwaffe's medical corps, who reported to Hermann Göring. This was a vertical career move for Strughold. He'd gone from a university teaching post to the top of the Reich's aviation medicine chain of command. The Reich had vast resources and a desire to conduct groundbreaking experiments for the benefit of its pilots. There were risks, but with risks came rewards. For Strughold, the reward was monumental. For 10 years he enjoyed a career as one of the most powerful physicians working for the Third Reich. In Berlin, Strughold treated his expansive new laboratory as a haven for risk-takers. Colleagues, including officials from the Nazi Party and the SS, would stop by to marvel over his work with the low-pressure chamber and the centrifuge. Experiments were almost always in progress. Strughold's medical assistants were forever allowing themselves to be hooked up to these odd-looking contraptions with pipes, valves, and hoses projecting from all sides. Assistants, one with and one without an